I want to explain the kind of why I made this kind of interface, the panel discussion. Actually, I'm a Buddhist. I was trained in the Buddhist philosophy. And then unlike this normal Buddhist monk, I was trained in many kind of different Buddhist traditions. I'm a Korean Buddhist monk. I came to America to get a PhD in the Department of Southeast East Asian Language and Culture. So I studied Sanskrit, and then Pali, and then later it's kind of I studied Tibetan language, and then also kind of the latest I went to Japan. I studied and then conducted research at the University of Tokyo. So I was a researcher over there, and then after finishing the PhD, I thought to understand the Korean Buddhism, I needed to know Tibetan Buddhism. So I went to the kind of India, the Karnataka. So I stayed at the Tibetan refugee camp in South India. And then I learned Tibetan Buddhism because to understand the Korean Buddhism, we should understand the Chinese Buddhism and the Tibetan Buddhism. If not, we could not understand the Korean Buddhism at all. Because Korean Buddhism came through China. Then in terms of the philosophy and the literature, Korean Buddhism was indebted with Chinese Buddhism. And then in terms of the literature and the art and the dance, Korean Buddhism was indebted to the Tibetan Buddhism through the Mongolian Empire. Because Mongol conquered Korea, but not Japan at all. Because Mongolian Empire had the best cavalry in the world. So they cannot attack and colonize Japan because they do not have a navy. So that's why the Korean Buddhism has so much kind of colorful art, just like this. Yeah? Actually, that kind of the paintings came from Tibet, but the Korean Buddhism is very similar to Tibetan Buddhism because of the Mongolian Empire. And then after coming back to America, I taught in the LA and then moved to Hawaii. And then I realized peace is really important. I was affiliated with the kind of Department of Philosophy and also affiliated with Department of Peace Studies. So from Hawaii, I began to understand. I expanded my research to the peace. In the beginning, I conducted research on the Buddhism and peace. But later, I realized that's not good enough because in the world, in the name of religion, they have so many violent wars. And then I realized how we should cooperate with other religions and make the world to be peaceful. And then I kind of collected articles from 250 renowned scholars across the world on peace. And then now that I am expanded my research project from Buddhism and peace to the religion and the peace. So after coming to the kind of this area, I talked with my friend and then asked him to arrange the interface kind of panel discussion to make the peace, to make the religion not to be troublemakers. Religion should support the world. Go together, make the world to be peace. That is my mission. Okay? Everybody else, okay? If you need something, please let us know and the steps. Feel free. Okay? And then anything else will be provided if we have. If we don't have, just forget it. Okay?
In fact, when the resume of Dr. Moon, when I showed it to my department people, they said, "Is this person for real?" It's a 16-page resume of a very distinguished scholar that we have with us. Okay, we will begin now the proceedings of this seminar. Most of the panelists I know, and I'm going to just briefly introduce them initially before we do our chanting ceremony. We have from the extreme left, I'm going to go that way. So from the extreme left, we have Mr. Alkesh Vipani from the Jain community. So he will be speaking on Jainism. Next to him is Mr. Kirsi Shroff, who is from the Zoroastrian community. So he'll be speaking on Zoroastrianism. Next to him is my good friend, and from our own George Washington University. He's actually the official chaplain at GW, and he is Chaplain Siafa Johnson, who is going to be talking on Protestant Baptist denomination of Christianity. And next to him is Dr. Roby Roy, who is from the Orthodox Coptic Christianity, which is the kind of Christianity that you find in Egypt. And let me just move over to, since you already know us, that is Dr. Shivram from the Hindu community, so therefore she's the Hinduism speaker. Next to him is actually Dr. Tariq Al-Gawari, who is our Islamic speaker. And there's something that I need to tell you about Dr. Al-Gawari, is that 10 years ago, he was a student of mine in George Washington University. I, who was a Buddhist, taught Dr. Gawari, whom I know as Tariq, a course on Zoroastrianism. So that can only happen in America. So that's Dr. Al-Gawari. He is a distinguished scholar of Islam. He has a PhD from Princeton. So very eminent person. And next to him is somebody whom I know equally well, and that's Father Rooney from the Catholic Christian tradition. So Father Rooney. And Father Jim Gardner, who is with him as well. So I'm going to now request our monks of the Theravada Buddhist tradition, led by Venerable Bhante Uparatana, Bhante Maitri, Ajahn Thangluang, and Ajahn Ket, to go to the podium and do the recitation in Pali for all of us. If you'll kindly stand, please, as the recitation is done.
We wish you all the best, good luck for the spiritual community. Thank you. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Itipiso bhagava arahant samma sambuddho vijjacharana sam sugato lokavidu anuttaro purisa dhamma sarati sattha dev sanam buddho bhagavati swakato bhagavata dhammo san akaliko ehi passiko upanayiko pacchattam veditabbo vinyo supatipanno bhagavato savaka sangho ujupatipanno bhagavato nyayapatipanno bhagavato savaka sangho Patipanno bhagavato savaka sangho yadidan chattari puris atta purisa puggala esa bhagavato savaka sangho ahuneyo dakhineyo anjali karaniyo anuttaram punyaketang lokasa etena sacca vajjena patu tvang ratanatayang etena sacca patu tvang ratanatayang etena sacca vajjena patu tvang ratanatayang. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
We will have a congratulatory video message from my master in Korea.
반갑습니다. 이번 워싱턴 연화정사에서 성원 스님이 부처님 오신 날을 맞이해서 세계 8대 종교 지도자들과 함께 국제 학술 세미나를 개최한다는 전가를 받았습니다. 불교는 우리들에게 인간이 인간답게 살아갈 수 있는 인간학을 주창하셨다고 말할 수 있습니다. 개인적으로는 인간답게 살아가는 한 사람이 모여서 세계 평화를 이룩할 수 있다는 믿음입니다. 종교인들에게 평화 건설은 선택의 문제가 아니라 당위성의 당연한 의무라고 생각이 되어집니다. 그래서 종교 간에 종교인들은 서로 상호 토론하고 함께 화합의 장에서 대화해야 될 것입니다. 이번 국제학술 세미나에서 주제를 발표해 주시는 지도자 여러분, 종교가 종교 간에, 종교인과 종교인 간에 먼저 선행되어야 할 일은 한 걸음씩 한 걸음씩 서로 다가와 상호 간에 토론하고 의사를 개진할 수 있는 그런 여건과 환경이 필요하다고 생각합니다. 우리 종교인들이 서로 합심해서
So nowadays we are supposed to have kind of flower offerings and then the baby Buddha, the bathing ceremony, but it will be very hard for now. So we will have a kind of baby Buddha bathing ceremony in the break individually. So they will go to the kind of panel presentation.
Okay, Venerable Moon has made me the first speaker, and I'll be speaking on Buddhism, particularly the life of the Buddha. The reason for that, why I chose this, is today is the Vesak, Mahavishaka Puja, as it is referred to in the Indian tradition, is the Buddha's birthday. So this is the day of his birth, his enlightenment, and his Mahaparinirvana, all taking place in the same day, full moon day of the month of Vishaka, in different years. So Lord Buddha lived between 563 to 483 BC, so for about 80 years. Right. The word Buddhism itself, it comes from the Sanskrit verbal root Buddh, meaning to awaken or to enlighten. So the word Buddha is not even a noun. It is actually speaking a past participle. Awakened or enlightened, that's all it means. So since it refers to a human being or a person, we add the definite article while translating it into English, the definite article in the prefix, and the impersonal pronoun in the suffix, and therefore it gets translated as the awakened one or the enlightened one. And the Buddha's dates are, it's a title that was given to him, and between 563 to 483 BC. There was no Nepal in those days. It's a bunch of what I would call feudatory confederacies at the foothills of the Himalayas. And one such kingdom was the Sakya kingdom. It was a very powerful kingdom. And the ruling monarch at that point in time in the 6th century BC happened to be one King Shododana and his spouse, the Queen Mahamaya. Neither of them had had any children for a long time. And one day, Queen Mahamaya dreamt of a white elephant coming in her dream, carrying a lotus stalk. And lotus, of course, is the symbol of the elephant itself is a symbol of royalty, majesty, dignity, and so on and so forth. And the lotus is a symbol of purity, making its way into her mouth and entering her womb. 9 months later, she gives birth to a baby boy, and that place is in Lumbini today in Nepal, and that is one of our 8 of the holiest places of Buddhist pilgrimage. So the very first one happens to be in Lumbini, Nepal, and that birth took place on the full moon day of the month of Vishaka in the year 563 before the Common Era. His parents named him Siddhartha, and since they were born, the cultural milieu was the Hindu tradition at that point in time. Astrologers were called to the royal court, and usually when astrologers get called to the royal court, more number of them arrive than is necessary because you get good fees at the end of it. So that's why. So therefore, the astrologers came, and let me point out some pictures because that's important. That is the Queen Mahamaya. As you can see, the white elephant carrying the lotus entering into her. If we can have these two lights off, please, so that way I think it'll work better. Just these two over there. There you go. That way people can see it better. All right, you can see that Queen Mahamaya, and in her dream, the white elephant having the lotus stalk. And here she gives birth to the baby Buddha right there. That's how we want to have the bathing ceremony. It's exactly as it is. So Lokottara, he's saying, I am the one, I'm in this earth, but I'm giving you a transcendental message. I have to bring it. And he never set foot on the ground. The lotuses bloomed as he kept walking. And he never gave any pain to his mother. He was born from the side, and she never experienced any labor pains. So he was an extraordinary child that you have over there. And this is, she was on her way to her father's house. So he was not born in the royal palace. That itself was an inclination that he would renounce the world one day. He was born in a park, the Park of Peace. So therefore, Lumbini Gardens, that is in Nepal today that you can see. All right. This is the 8 astrologers that you can see there, and all of them are old men. That's King Shododana with his little baby prince Siddhartha. And you can see all of them are holding 2 fingers up like that, except for the youngest one with the black hair holding a single finger up. Is that they made a prediction that the ones that holding the 2 fingers, that he can either, they all agreed he would be a leader of men. What kind of leader of men? He could be the leader of men in the sense of a great military leader, or he could be the leader of men in the sense of being a spiritual leader. Big deal. Even I could have told you that, and I'm not even an astrologer. So, but only one of them said, no, he's definitely going to be a great religious leader. He was the most intelligent of them, and he was the one who gave the decision that this was the case. But that did not bother them so much that one day This is all within the week, okay? It's not too far. Comes the sage Asita Devala. Asita Devala was a very respected sage, and these people don't even come when you even invite them. And he comes to the royal palace at Kapilavastu of the Sakya kingdom uninvited. And of course, the guards usher him in, and the king is very happy to see him. And he says, I want to see the baby boy that has just been born to you. So the young prince is brought in front of him into the presence of the venerable sage. And the sage takes the baby, Prince Siddhartha, in his arms, and he suddenly is happy, and all of a sudden he begins to cry, both at the same time. So the king and the queen are perturbed by this. They say, we can understand somebody is happy, and we can understand somebody is sad, but not at the same time. So kindly explain yourself, sir. So the sage said, no problem. He said, the reason why I am happy is that, look here, I'm already an old man, that I lived long enough to see the birth of this extraordinary child. And the reason I'm crying is that precisely for that reason, that I'm already an old man, that I will not live long enough to see this young boy grow up to be a great religious teacher at whose feet I can sit and learn the great wisdom he's about to impart to the world. That's the reason why I'm both happy as well as sad. So then they understood the sage sentiment, and at that point in time, with a single dissenting opinion, and this great venerable sage coming in unannounced, they knew they had an extraordinary child. So what happens is, a week after Prince Siddhartha's birth, the Queen Mahamaya experienced childbirth complications, and she's about to die. They tell her, the doctors of those days tell her, there's not much hope for you. So therefore, that is going to be the end of my story. But before she passes away, she calls her younger sister, the Princess Prajapati Gautami, to her bedside, and she says, you need to promise me two things. One is that you will marry my soon-to-be widowed husband. He's going to become a widower once I die. And even more importantly, the reason why I'm asking you to do that is that you please raise Prince Siddhartha as your own son. There's no better person that I can think of than my own sister. You will raise him with the same care and affection as I would have. So if you promise me that, then I will die peacefully. Princess Prajapati Gautami promises, and Queen Mahamaya passes into history. So that is the situation. But then we come a little bit fast forward into Lord Buddha's life, or Prince Siddhartha's life. He has a cousin called Devadatta, Prince Devadatta. And the two young princes, they were first cousins to each other. So they used to be in the royal palace grounds going about. And one day, when the two princes were playing about, the young Prince Devadatta spies a bird on the tree. And so he takes his little slingshot arrow, bow and arrow, and hits the bird. The bird comes, drops down, throbbing to the ground, agonizing. And Prince Siddhartha looks at his cousin as he's doing here. How could you have done something like this? Are you crazy? So Prince Devadatta says, look here, we are born into royalty. One of the things about the royalty is we are supposed to hunt. Royalty has got 4 vices. If you are not one of those, if you don't have those 4, you're not much of a royalty. That is hunting, gambling, drinking, and womanizing. If you don't do those, you are not much of a royalty. So this is hunting. It's part of our royal way of doing things. So therefore, Prince Siddhartha is not prepared to buy that argument. He takes the bird and nurses it back to health. Later on, Prince Devadatta comes to him and says, that bird is mine, give it back to me. And Prince Siddhartha says, I'm not going to do any such thing. So they happen to be decent young men, so they said, we'll go in front of a magistrate, a court. And of course, the magistrate is not trying to ordinary citizens. He's trying to members of the royal family. So, but he was a very resourceful judge. So what he said is, young men, leave that bird on the floor, and both of you stand aside. And there's a vast audience watching the whole thing. So let's see what happens. And slowly the bird starts to ambulate towards Prince Siddhartha. And so the judge says, I don't have to make any decision. Nor you, nor these young men. The bird has made the decision for all of us. He pronounces the statement, life belongs to the person who tries to protect it, not to the person who tries to snuff it out. This basic Buddhist teaching is taught as the fundamentals of Buddhist education throughout the Buddhist world, from Sri Lanka to Japan, from Tibet to Vietnam. Throughout the 13 nations of the Buddhist world is the commencement of Buddhist ethics, not to harm any living being. It's not a question not to harm any human being. That courtesy needs to be extended to every aspect of creation, if I may call it that. So that's the wounded bird incident. Prince Siddhartha gets married to the princess of a neighboring kingdom, the Princess Yashodhara, in the year 547 BC. And the royals spend 13 years. They have a son called Rahula. And of course, what happens is Prince Siddhartha is not satisfied with his life. Of all the luxury, in fact, later on when he becomes the Buddha, he says, I had a servant to tie my left shoe. I had a servant to tie my right shoe. I had the finest silks from Benares. And I was decked from top to toe in any kind of gold ornament that I wanted, but there was something that was lacking. And therefore, he says, at that point in time, he was assigned a charioteer by the name Channa. Just take me outside the palace walls. And the charioteer says, Master, you are asking for the impossible, because the king and queen have told that you are not to be taken outside the palace walls. So he says, I know this is the 29th year. It seems to happen to every major religious leader. They know something is wrong with the status quo, and they need to change it. So that happens to Prince Siddhartha as well. So on his first outing, he sees a sick person, hardly able to move, bent and beaten with sickness of all kinds, and therefore he's on the sidewalk, nobody to take care of him. So Prince Siddhartha says, what's wrong with this person, Channa? So he lived such a sheltered existence. And Channa says, Master, not everybody is born into royalty. You're lucky. That person that you see there is poor. And he's poor and he doesn't have anything. And that is going to be his situation for the remainder of his life. If you're sick and you're poor, you have no other option. That touches Prince Siddhartha deeply. Then the second outing, he sees an aged person. Again, bent and beaten with age, hardly able to move a few paces without some kind of ambulatory device. And there, the same kind of situation, he asks Channa, and Channa says, Master, at least in the previous case, if you have good genes, you can somehow avoid the sickness, but this happens to all of us. It does not matter who you are. You can be a poorest man and you can be the royalty, but age touches everybody. So then the third one is that of a funeral procession, where he sees this cortege being taken, and everybody asks, why is this all this wailing going around this procession? So Channa tells Master, this is because they'll never see the person as they knew him or her, the person. That's the reason for all this grief. But then the fourth one is a very different situation. He sees a monk sitting in a meditational posture together with himself. And then he tells Channa, look here, Channa, all of the other sights were disturbing. This seems different. What is special about this one? What does he have that I don't have? He seems to be so together with himself. He's serene, he's calm, he's peaceful. And Channa says, Master, it's not, you should have asked the question the other way around. It's not a question of what he has. It's a question of what he does not have. He owns nothing. He's a monk. He has given up everything. So that becomes the mark. It's the positive thing in terms, these are known as the four passing sites in later Buddhist hagiology. All right, later on we see down the road in his life, Channa, Prince Siddhartha tells Channa, you have taken me outside the palace walls 4 times, now you need to take me outside the palace wall for one last time. And Channa thinks now he's really overdoing it and he's in deep trouble. So he cannot, after all, the prince is his master, so he goes out, takes a last look at his sleeping wife and child for the very last time, and crosses the Anoma River, which still runs in Nepal today. And they're having symbolically crossed the Anoma River. He takes off all of his gold ornaments and says, Channa, in case my father dismisses you from your job, this is your pension plan. Okay, I have no further use for it. So therefore, he wanders the roads of what is today Uttar Pradesh, Bihar area of India for 6 years. This is so you can call it the dark night of the soul. He goes to 2 yoga teachers. He becomes their disciple, but he's not too satisfied with their teaching. And then ultimately comes to a place called Gaya, which is today located in the Bihar state of India. And there he makes a resolution under the Bodhi tree. The Bodhi tree is one of those humongous tropical trees where if you have 100 people, it'll have room for 100 more. In a hot country like India, you would appreciate things like that. So therefore, underneath the base of the Bodhi tree, he makes a resolution that he will not get up from the base of the Bodhi tree until he has found to his satisfaction what is it that causes human suffering at all levels. And the person who sat down is merely the Prince Gautama, the mere monk Gautama at that point in time, arises as the enlightened one, the Buddha. So that is Buddhism's holiest city among the 8 cities, and that's in Bodh Gaya. That enlightenment took place in the year 528 BC. Here are some pictures. The scene of the Great Renunciation. I remember this in a particular way that I can never forget. I was a graduate student in 1972 in Thailand, and this was a kind of situation where I'd gone to a particular temple in the capital city of Bangkok. The Thais are very devout Buddhists, and one of the young monks met me at how friendly the Thais are. They are always called the land of smiles. So the young monk, who is no more than 13, 14 years old, he took me around the temple and he says, can you come in the evening? And I said, for what? And he said, well, our abbot is going to give a sermon on the life of the Buddha. And I said, I knew what my suspicions were. I said, in what language is he going to give this sermon? Oh, he's going to give it in Thai. I said, wonderful, I'm going to understand every word of it. My Thai in those days was what I would call street Thai or butler Thai. You just went into a restaurant, said something, and as long as he brought you the proper food, that was the end of the story. But here, in this case, what happened was, when I went there at 6 p.m., it was a large auditorium where you had extended members of the Thai royal family, you had Thai military leaders, prominent businessmen, and you had a whole bunch of people. He was a very high-ranking, the abbot of the temple was a very high-ranking member of the Thai Sangha. So I, as a poor graduate student, young fellow, came and sat, and my young friendly monk met me, and we sat together. And he said, I will translate, don't worry, I'll translate for you whenever it's needed. At one point in time, I could see as a sight that I've never forgotten since the past 45 years. The entire audience just broke down and cried. And at that point in time, they said, was this. I said, did the abbot talk about the great scene of the Great Renunciation? And my young monk friend said, yes. But it was not more than anything what really triggered their deep emotion was when the abbot said, it's not that the Buddha loved his family less, but he loved the world more. So this is the scene of the great renunciation at the Anoma River in Nepal, where he's giving to Channa everything that he owns. And here is his 6 years of spiritual quest between the years 534 to 528 BC. This is the scenario of his enlightenment, the full moon day of May, Vesak, in the year 528 BC. That tree is the holiest shrine today in all of Buddhism. And then these were the traditions that he had that coexisted at the time of the advent of Buddhism. You had all these various philosophies. The only two prominent ones that I can think of is Jainism and, of course, Vedic Hinduism. All the other traditions, of course, died out. But this just to give you a scenario of what was the situation. These were the great disciples of the Buddha. In other words, they were the first 5 disciples. They actually abandoned him, and eventually they got back to him, and it is to them he sermoned, gave his first sermon at Sarnath, which is Benares, the second holiest city of the Buddhist world. So Emperor Ashoka, who was the first great Buddhist emperor, has built pillars all over today, and I must say this, the flag of the Republic of India, including its emblem, is not Hindu, it's Buddhist, and that is Emperor Ashoka's symbol. So here you have his 2 important disciples. I can tell you stories about that, but in the interest of time, just note Sariputta and Mahamoggallana. These were royal members of the family, especially King Bimbisara, who was the king of Magadha at that point in time. These are the 5 disciples whom he gave the first sermon at Sarnath, where the Dhammachakra Parivartana, as we call it in Pali, took place at that point in time. The Sangha, the initial Sangha, was formed at this juncture. And the Buddhist monastic community has kept those rules and regulations to this day. This is the Prince Rahula. When it comes to back to Kapilavastu, the Princess Yashodhara tells her son, go, you know that monk who is there? That's your father. Go ask him for inheritance. So innocently, Prince Rahula goes and approaches the Buddha for his inheritance. He says, I'm a monk. I have nothing to give you. If you want, I can make you a member of the Sangha. So Prince Rahul also becomes a member of the Sangha, and in fact, the entire royal family eventually becomes the member of the Sangha. This is Mahamoggallana and Sariputta, the great disciples and the most learned disciples of the Buddha. They are enshrined today in the Sanchi Stupa in Madhya Pradesh in India. This is one of the great, and Emperor Ashoka built a monument here too. This is the story of Patachara. In the interest of time, I'm just going. It's a lady who suffered 6 tragedies in one day. It's a very beautiful story, and Lord Buddha gives her the first ordination. She becomes a nun, a bhikkhuni, that we call in Pali. All right, the first sermon gave basically these teachings, the 3 marks of existence, the 12-fold wheel of causality, the 4 noble truths, the noble eightfold path. That's the theoretical teaching of Buddhism. This is the practical side. This is core Buddhism. This is basic Buddhism. This is all that the Buddha preached throughout his ministry. And I don't care from which branch of Buddhism you come from, and from which Buddhist country you come from, these basic things are accepted by all Buddhists. And then he passes away, his Mahaparinirvana taking place in the year 483 BC, also on the full moon day, at Kusinara, which is today in Uttar Pradesh state of India. So those are the 4 holiest places: place of his birth, place of his enlightenment, the place of the first sermon, and the place of the Mahaparinirvana. This is the Mahaparinirvana scene of Lord Buddha passing away in terms of that. All right, this is the classification of the Buddhist countries of the world. Buddhism is divided into 3 major branches. The Theravada form of Buddhism, which the venerables chanted in Pali. This is also called Pali Buddhism. It is to be found in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and some portion of Vietnam. I would say near the Mekong River Delta, what is today Ho Chi Minh City area. That alone is Theravada. Then you have Mahayana tradition, which Venerable Chanju Moon belongs to, and that's China, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, Japan, and most of Vietnam is Mahayana Buddhism. Vietnam is a very unique nation in the Buddhist world. It's the only nation which follows both the Theravada as well as the Mahayana traditions. And the third branch of Buddhism is Vajrayana. This is Lamaism. The Dalai Lama is only the head of this branch of Buddhism, okay? He's not, sometimes they call it the Pope of Buddhism. Well, even the Pope is not the head of all of Christianity. He's only the head of the Roman Catholic branch. The Orthodox and the Protestant branches do not acknowledge. Similarly, the Dalai Lama is only the head of this branch of Buddhism. So the Tibetan Buddhism, we have Venerable Losang Tenrol from that tradition here. So she's a Vajrayana Buddhist nun. Tibet, Bhutan, Mongolia, Sikkim and Ladakh regions of India, and even the northwest regions of the Caspian Sea, and some in Siberia. So even in Vladimir Putin's army, you have among the Cossacks who are good, devout Vajrayana Buddhists. So this is a very good picture of inter-Buddhist goodwill, examples of Asian Buddhist goodwill. You have the abbot of one of the most important Buddhist monasteries in China, the Dashingshan Monastery, and that is Prime Minister Modi of India, and in between them is President Xi Jinping. So you have many members of the Chinese Communist Party who are devout followers of Buddhism. And here is an image of the monk Kumarajiva that is being presented. He is the Indian monk from Kashmir who went and translated all of the Mahayana Sutras from Sanskrit to Mandarin Chinese. And the Chinese gave him the title Goshe, which means in Chinese, the instructor of the nation. Kumarjiva must have deeply impressed the Chinese. The Chinese are not the kind of people who would give titles to foreigners that easily. So that is the thing that you find here. And then you have Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Mrs. Abe of Japan being blessed by the monks of the Sri Lankan Buddhist Sangha during his visit to Colombo, Sri Lanka. So this is basically the geography of the Buddhist world, Buddhist family of nations. You can see Sri Lanka and Bhutan are the only ones in South Asia. The rest of it is pretty much in East Asia. This is one form of Buddhism. Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, that's Mahayana Buddhism, and Tibet and Mongolia is Vajrayana Buddhism. And that's the Caspian Sea that I was talking about. You see the Caspian Sea up north there, you see a little bit of brown, that's where the Kazakhs are, Vajrayana Buddhists. So with that, thank you for listening to me, taking the time to do so. Thank you.
We had a wonderful kind of presentation. It's about on the Buddhism. It's by Dr. Heba. So
I just have blank at the beginning because I'm just going to talk a little bit. We wanted to do saints because for the Catholic Church, that's something that is kind of unique for Christianity. Although saints are all across, I think, all religions and certainly all parts of Christianity. I did go ahead and Google Translate Korean. I don't know if that works or not, so I apologize in advance. If I just, because it doesn't work, I don't know, because it makes no, I can't say. But so what I did was I have a short presentation about what saints are, why we venerate them, and then 4 examples that I have brought together. And I'm a very visual person, so I like a lot of pictures, so that's basically what I did here. So we would say, first of all, that a saint in our tradition is someone who is a witness to Christ, Jesus Christ, who for us is the Son of God, God incarnate. So we believe that in his humanity we see the invisible God visible in him. So we spend all of our time studying and praying, meditating on Christ himself so that we might come to be more like him. So we say, first of all, a saint would be someone who would look something like Christ. Now, in Christianity, we believe that saints are in heaven, that is to say, in the afterlife, they are with God in heaven, but not limited only to those who are with God in heaven, but also those who are on earth. This is a Russian icon which represents the saints in heaven as well as the saints on earth. Saints are people whose witness of life is holiness. Not necessarily the usual caricature of the person with their hands folded looking up to heaven like you sometimes see in very sentimental religious images. The person who discerns the will of God for his or her life and for the world around him and actively seeks to do it. The word saint in Christianity is used both to describe those who enjoy the presence of God and all perfection in heaven, what we call the beatific vision, but also those who, by their faithfulness and virtuous life, have become outward signs of Jesus Christ in their own lives. They are living witnesses. The communion of saints. So as Christians believe that life doesn't end in death, but that we rather pass over from this world to the kingdom of God, that there is a fluidity, a kind of continuity of relationship. Friendships forged in this life do not end in death. There is, figuratively speaking, a curtain drawn between here and there. Yet we are present to one another. There is a sharing in the life of God, of mutual affection and support. Those on earth venerate and honor those who are above, but we do not worship them. They remain our friends, our family. They pray for us just as we would so easily ask a brother or sister to pray for us here on this earth. They are inspiration. They are spiritual support in the mystical life of God's creation, heaven and earth. The Christian tradition is filled with examples of how saints have continued to help persons in time and space with miracles from heaven. In the Catholic Church, formally speaking, a saint is one who knows God's favor in heaven and has been proclaimed so through the process called canonization. Canonization is a long process of proving the historical truth of a candidate's heroic virtue and likeness to Jesus Christ. They are proclaimed by the Church as examples of living and intercessors to God on our behalf, and given a feast day in the calendar of the Church's prayer year. Usually it is the day of their death, the day that they are born to eternal life. You may have heard recently that Pope Francis canonized two of his predecessors, Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II. This is because they responded to God's call and sought to do his will with great love and service, bringing about great reform and faith. This is not to say, however, that only those formally acclaimed by the Church as saints are with God. There are countless saints, though not formally canonized. In the Catholic Church, it is a pious practice to pray to saints, not as gods or those who would bring about any sort of salvation that would be in addition to what Jesus Christ already accomplished for us with his own suffering, death, and resurrection, but as friends or brothers and sisters, because they are in the presence of God and can pray for us on our behalf, and they inspire us to seek and grow in holiness, to be saints ourselves. In this way, it can be said that the kingdom of God is here among us as we grow in holiness in God's presence, already, but not yet, because the fulfillment of all God's plan for his creation is not here on this earth, but it is in his heavenly kingdom of perfect joy, love, and peace. Now we're going to speak of four saints from four different eras, each showing a different aspect of what sainthood looks like in the context of this world, and I have a couple of quotes from each. The first saint is St. Paul. St. Paul was one of the first apostles, though not one of the original 12 chosen by Jesus to inherit his mission of mercy and salvation. He was born sometime between 5 BC and 5 AD, probably died in the persecution of the Roman Emperor Nero around the year 65. He was the greatest evangelizer of the apostolic age. That is to say, he dedicated his life to the spread of the message of Jesus Christ in the then-known Western world. 14 of the 27 books of the Bible's New Testament are attributed in some way to him, mostly the letters which he wrote to various cities and communities with whom he spent time in his travels. He is an example of tireless teaching and prayer and faithfulness. He also shows to us how God can change our life. Prior to being an apostle, Paul, or Saul, which was his Greek name, was one of the leading persecutors of the new Christian faith, executing Christians seeking to suppress the growth of the Christian community. In an account following Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus himself appears to Paul and asks him why he is persecuting him. The encounter brought about such great conversion that Paul's life took an entirely new direction. Eventually, after years of selfless service, including imprisonments, beatings, attempted executions, much suffering, Paul made the ultimate sacrifice as a martyr in Rome. This is a photo I took when I was in Ephesus. This is one of the, this is a stadium where Paul spoke in the city of Ephesus. And here's a quote from him. But now remains faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. This is the market in Ephesus. And another quote, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Jesus Christ himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. That's actually what we celebrate today. That's what Pentecost is the coming of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles. This is the statue of St. Paul that stands before St. Peter's in the Vatican in Rome. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. In an event in the Gospels, we hear about the transfiguration of Jesus when Jesus revealed to Peter, James, and John, three of his apostles, the glorified form of his life. He often went into the desert to seek solitude and to pray, and on this one occasion, he takes Peter, James, and John to the top of Mount Tabor to reveal his glory. In the earliest traditions of Christianity, people sought the presence of God in the most austere and isolated places. Our next saint is Saint Anthony of Egypt, or Anthony the Great. St. Anthony lived between the years 251 and 356. He was the first great desert father, so-called, an ascetic who went into the desert of the Sinai, east of Alexandria, to seek a life of intense simplicity and solitary prayer, just as Jesus did in the desert, and just as the Israelites did in the same desert as they were waiting to enter the Promised Land. He believed the distractions of this world kept him from focusing on God and virtue. This radical witness of seeking God became a powerful movement in Christianity as people joined monastic communities. He remained alone until his holiness and evident wholesomeness attracted such a growing circle of followers that hundreds of people followed him into the desert. So he didn't really get away from them after all, did he? So deep was his influence that he is considered the father not only of the movement of desert fathers and mothers of 4th and 5th century Egypt, but also the father of the entire Christian monastic community. The tradition was published by John Cassian, who took it with him to what is today southern France, and eventually became the foundation of Christian monasticism. Such a life of contemplative prayer has remained the spirituality of the saints throughout the succeeding centuries. This is a photograph of the path that you walk up when you go to visit the cave where St. Anthony lived. Here's a quote. Whoever hammers a lump of iron first decides what he's going to make of it, a scythe, a sword, or an axe. Even so, we ought to make up our minds what kind of virtue we want to forge, or else we labor in vain. This is the entrance to the cave itself. And then my favorite part, you turn around 180 degrees, and this is his view. Location, 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 right? Here's another quote. The truly intelligent man pursues one sole objective, to obey and conform to the God of all. With this single aim in view, he disciplines his soul, and whatever he may encounter in the course of his life, he gives thanks to God for the compass and depth of his providential ordering of all things. The rule of Saint Benedict included many of the teachings of Anthony as recorded by John Cassian. I have a quote here. Let them first pray together so they may associate in peace. I use that sometimes as a theme for interreligious prayer gatherings. This is a typical early church from the 8th century, a monastic foundation in Tuscany, Italy, called San Salvatore on Mount Amiata. And then the best monastic settlement that I've ever visited, monastic communities went to the extreme edges of civilization to seek the solitude and carry the gospel. Here, an early 5th century community on Skellig Michael, a jagged island off the westernmost coast of Ireland. Communities traveled further and further west over the years as seen in the migration of those who were originally called Galatians at the time of St. Paul, Gallicans in southwestern Europe in the next century, finally the Gaelic people who migrated with Christianity to Britain and Ireland. One of the most visible and beloved saints is St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis lived in the early medieval period, a time of great development and reform in the church, between 1181 and 1226. He also embraced a life of poverty, simplicity, and joy. Born a nobleman, he gave up his life of privilege to find deeper intimacy with God in his community. He is most known for the way he praised God through God's creation, calling all aspects of God's creation his brothers and sisters. Even poverty and compassion itself were his companions. He was also a fierce reformer of the church after receiving a vision from Christ himself to go and repair my house. Francis became a champion of the poor and the outcast, and he spent his life in humble service. Francis was also involved in relationships with the leadership of the church. Here he is pictured with Pope, as well as interreligious dialogue. Here's a quote. We have been called to heal wounds, to unite what has fallen apart, to bring home those who have lost their way. This is a picture of his monastery today in Assisi. It didn't look like this when he was there, I'll tell you that, but this is what it looks like today. And then perhaps one of my most favorite quotes of St. Francis that you probably have never heard before. He says, we should not so much seek to pray, but to become prayer. Probably recognize this guy, Pope Francis. Pope Francis chose Francis of Assisi's name when he became Pope, instead of his baptismal name, Jorge, or George. And this is a quote that Pope Francis made of St. Francis of Assisi. He brought to Christianity an idea of poverty against the luxury, pride, and vanity of the civil and ecclesiastical powers of the time. He changed history. Finally, our last saint today is a modern saint who lived within the last century, Father Miguel Pro, who was a Jesuit priest in Mexico. This is a photo of the church in Mexico City where Father Pro's body is laid to rest. He's called blessed, not saint, because the process for canonization has not yet been completed. Blessed is the step before being proclaimed a saint. This means that his heroic virtues have been proven, but the church awaits proof of 2 miracles on his behalf that will indicate that he is in God's presence with certainty. He lived from 1891 to 1927, and most of his life was during times of great persecution in Mexico. When he went to this Jesuit seminary, he was in exile in Belgium. He returned to Mexico as a priest, forced to live and practice his faith underground. the French, or the Mexican government was controlled by French Freemasons, who at the time had as their principal goal the destruction of the Catholic Church. So there was a great deal of persecution that took place in Mexico. It doesn't hardly ever make it into the history books, but it'd be interesting for you to look it up. It's an interesting history. Anyway, he was wrongfully accused for an assassination attempt on the life of Mexican President Obregón. He was executed by firing squad in 1927. He was arrested. He was not given a trial. And the support, he gained a lot of support during the time called the Cristero War. Known for his religious piety and innocence, he was baptized on September 25th, 1988 by Pope St. John Paul II as a Catholic martyr, killed in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith. The effects of the war on the church were profound in these years. Between 1926 and 34, nearly 400 priests were killed. There were 4,500 priests serving the people before the rebellion, but by 1934 there were only 334 licensed by the government, 334 priests to serve 15 million people. The rest had been eliminated by immigration, expulsion, and assassination. By 1935, 17 saints had no priests at all. This is what Pope John Paul II said at his beatification. Neither suffering nor serious illness, neither the exhausting ministerial activity, frequently carried out in difficult and dangerous circumstances, could stifle the radiating and contagious joy with which he brought to his life for Christ, and which nothing could take away. Indeed, the deepest root of self-sacrificing surrender for the lowly was his passionate love for Jesus Christ and his ardent desire to be conformed to him, even unto death. He asked to be able to kneel and pray before he was assassinated. And then this is a government photograph of him the moment that he was about to be assassinated, to be executed by firing squad. "10,000 people attended his funeral, though the Mexican government would not even allow a priest to preside at his burial." This is a quote from Father Pro. "Does our life become from day to day more painful, more oppressive, more replete with afflictions? Blessed be he 1,000 times who desires it so. If life be harder, love makes it also stronger. And only this love, grounded on suffering, can carry the cross of my Lord Jesus Christ." The communion of saints for us is a great comfort. It is an opportunity for us to continue to hold on to these relationships. So there's something we do in the Christian church when we're confirmed. We choose the name of a saint to be our sponsor. So my saint was Saint Anthony of Padua. And I was only a child when I chose Saint Anthony, but even at that point I was scared to death of getting up in front of people and talking. St. Anthony was a great preacher. I was fascinated by his story. And I've kept this relationship with him all my life. I think it's because of his assistance that I am able to stand and talk in front of you today. So thank you very much.
So the next presenter will be the Hinduism. So Dr. Sudhua Sivaram, okay, for the 20 minutes. Okay.
So thank you, Abbot Moon and Professor Hebar. It's indeed an honor to be here sharing the stage with the scholars, both on my left and right. I'm here as a practitioner of Hinduism, and my scholarship continues. I have been raised as a Hindu, and I represent here the Chinmaya Mission Washington Regional Center, a Hindu spiritual center and religious center both in Maryland and Virginia, as well as the Hindu America Foundation. So let's begin by seeing how many of us are awake by answering a simple question. So when you hear the word Hinduism, what comes to your mind? ism. So the chasm and the separation is wrong, is what our colleague is saying. Anybody else? The caste system, okay, we can talk about that a little bit as well. I'm sorry? Cows, okay. So here, so what I'll try to do is to talk about how we can live our lives using the guiding principles of Hinduism. So that's what I've been asked to talk about, principles and relevance to daily life. So one of the ultimate goals of practicing Hindus is the process of seeking truth. Now, truth is a very deep concept. It's timeless, it's immutable, and it is an absolute concept. And it is something that is beyond the human mind, but it is something that in our lifetimes as human beings, we can try to achieve. And a lot of, and I teach Sunday school, and a lot of students ask me, so when did Hinduism start? You know, is there a founder? Is there a person? But what we as Hindus believe is we believe in the value of Sanatana Dharma, which is basically an eternal practice of faith and philosophy. So there is really no founder. There is really no set doctrine or creed, but we are guided by holy books, we are guided by scriptures that provide us a lot of in-depth knowledge as to how to live our lives. So there are 4 goals in Hinduism as regard to human lives. First is the concept of dharma. And dharma really refers to how do you conduct yourself in your life. The second is the notion of artha, which refers to material goods. We all want a house, we all have cars, you know, if we have one, we may want one more or another new one. So this process of accumulation of material wealth is a goal that many human beings have. And then there is the sensual or the sensory pleasures that human beings indulge in, kama. And finally, an ultimate goal of Hinduism is the goal of salvation or moksha, where we seek to liberate ourselves from the things that bind us in our daily lives. So moksha is something that is an active pursuit in Hinduism by all those who practice the principles of Hinduism. Now, how do we get there? Now, as we pursue these goals of Hinduism, we have to bear in mind a very central tenet, which you may have heard about, called the law of karma. Now, karma is, sometimes I like to think of it as Newton's third law, right? For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, whereas how karma is interpreted is that every action has consequences. So we Hindus believe that whatever we do today is going to help us form our destiny later on, and the way we are today is informed and indeed influenced by what our past actions have been. So this is a very central tenet of how we look at life and how we look at actions in Hinduism. So what karma does is, as we live day to day, we are asked to be fully accountable. So we can choose to do certain things, we can choose not to do certain things, and so that kind of accountability is sort of an incentive for us. So we all say, you know, let's gather good karma by doing something. And that is actually a very essential principle of how we practice Hinduism. Now, the other thing that I talked about as a goal is dharma. Now, we talked about actions, which are karma just now. Dharma is basically a principle by which we sustain and protect our values and we cultivate good qualities. So dharma is almost the right thing to do. So when you talk about karma, you talk about the actions that you do, whereas dharma is a principle that guides us to choose a certain path and do well in that path. Now, some of the common principles of dharma you might recognize. The first and foremost is the quality of ahimsa, and Professor Hebbar mentioned it. Ahimsa means non-violence. So that's a central tenet of Hinduism. Non-injury, an act of love. Another concept of dharma is that the way you choose to do your work, the way you conduct your life, has to be grounded in integrity and truthfulness. Finally, in addition to ahimsa, non-violence, truth or satya, we have the notion of brahmacharya. Brahmacharya refers to the concept of self-discipline and not being able to indulge in pleasures, in material goods. That ability to restrain yourself is referred to as brahmacharya. And essentially, as I study Hinduism more and more, what I find is that it can be tailored to any kind of person. You could be in different stages of evolution as a human being. You could be someone who is just beginning to think about how to live your life. You could have done and achieved many things in life, and you're suddenly thinking about immersing yourself in Hinduism. And it allows you, at whatever stage you are, to begin to practice Hinduism and practice these essential principles in a relatively easy way. And that is what I mean by the importance of context. It could be someone who is very poor with very little resources, someone who is very rich, not just materially, but also in terms of values. And so Hinduism allows us to choose our own context and live by these principles of ahimsa, non-violence, seeking the truth always, satya, and with a measure of self-restraint and non-indulgence. Now, so we have karma, our deeds. We have dharma, the values that guide us. So I talked about moksha, which is the ultimate goal that is within the reach of humanity. And moksha is basically a state where you are liberated from the cycle of life and birth. So Hindus believe, and as I told you in the karma slide, that what we are today is because of what we did in the past, and what will happen to us in the future is based on the actions that we do now. And depending on the quality of these actions in life, you are reborn. Your body is reborn in another form, and moksha essentially liberates you from that cycle of life and birth. You rise above sorrow. You're able to, in a state of moksha, spread a lot of joy, and you're able to connect with the universal consciousness within. So people who are practitioners of Hinduism, and we will talk a little bit about this in a few slides, seek that inner truth or universal consciousness. And Hindus believe that each one of us has that light or consciousness within us. And the practice of Hinduism is essentially trying to seek that light that we all have within us, using the principles of dharma and using the principles of karma, as I just outlined. But how does one indeed reach this ultimate goal of moksha? So there are essentially 4 types of yoga, and yoga, the way I'm going to talk about it, refers to this practice of extreme discipline and focus. And there are 4 kinds of yoga that the Hindu scriptures talk about. First is karma yoga. Karma is to do. Essentially, and this really I think is a principle across all religions, is the principle of selfless, dedicated service. And that essentially is what karma yoga is. Basically, do your duty, do not expect something in return for the effort that you put in. Always think of your duty as something that you're offering to God, and always act as an instrument of God. So these are the basic concepts around karma yoga. So that's the first kind of yoga. The second kind relates to knowledge or jnana. Now in jnana yoga, so as an individual, I could just do karma yoga to achieve moksha, right? Or I could do jnana yoga, which is I could immerse myself in the deep study of scriptures. I could begin a process of accumulating knowledge that is inherently present in the scriptures, and I could inquire, I could reflect, I could study, I could get a PhD, like many of my colleagues here. And the essential purpose of pursuing jnana yoga is to put into practice what you learn. And clearly, for this type of pursuit towards salvation, you need to be intellectually sharp. You need to have a sense of discipline and focus so that you can indeed master the teachings that are enshrined in the scriptures. Now, the third type of yoga that will help us get to salvation is called Raja Yoga. Now, there are about 8 practices within Raja Yoga, and I'm going to list them all, and some of them may be more familiar to you than the others. So first of all is called yamas. This is a kind of yoga that teaches you about the various disciplines of life. It teaches you about morality and ethics of conducting your life. And the second are spiritual practices. The third and fourth kind of Raja Yoga are something that is now popularized universally, right? We all talk about yoga, let's go to yoga, right? And so what we do in that kind of a context is basically practice physically postures that are going to center our physical body and center our mind. And that we do through physical postures called as asanas. We could also do that through breathing exercises or pranayama. And I'm going to go ahead and list the other 4. There are different other kinds of Raja Yoga that look at how to concentrate your mind, how to make your mind in a way that is not disturbed by other senses. So practicing different types of meditation, for instance, they come under the realm of Raja Yoga. The fourth kind of yoga is related to devotion and bhakti. Now before that, it's important to know that when you have a goal to achieve moksha, and when you have a goal to achieve a stillness of mind or to practice yoga, there are certain things that you need to have as a human being. First of all, you need to have a physical ability and fitness to do this practice. And it is not just the asanas, but even to meditate. You have to be in a physical state of mind and in a state of mind that you can concentrate and practice these principles. You have to have a disciplined lifestyle, and it is not enough if you do it just for a day or two. It has to be a sustained practice for you to achieve those that the great sages have achieved. And the reason I say this, before the fourth yoga or bhakti yoga will become apparent in a few minutes, bhakti means devotion, and that is something that I think transcends all religions. And in bhakti yoga, you're not doing any asanas, you're not doing meditation all the time. What you're doing is your focus is on God. So there is deep prayer, there is various practices in the Hindu culture to evoke intense love of God, to completely concentrate on God. And in bhakti yoga, really you need to have any prerequisites. You can be of poor physical health, you can be a child, you can be a person who is a little older. All you need to do is to have that intense love towards God. Now you will notice I have not really defined what God is in Hinduism, right? I have talked to you about how you conduct your life, karma yoga, the right paths of dharma. I have talked to you about 4 types of yoga. Now let us see what is God in Hinduism. In other words, how do you seek this God, right? How do you seek divinity? Now, we believe this can be done in three ways, right? You could see divinity almost as a philosophy. You could see God through the practice of yoga, or you could use some kind of a devotional anchor. And let me explain what this means. If you're seeking God as from a philosophical point of view, Hindus define the ultimate consciousness as Brahman. And Brahman exists in everybody, in fact, in everything. And that pure consciousness, you do not have to go to a temple to seek it. You do not have to, climb the Himalayas to achieve it. It is within our own selves. And that kind of very disciplined pursuit of the Brahman is a way to seek God by sort of inner reflection. Because that kind of God is the light within you. It is formless. It's always there. And why haven't you achieved it? It's because you're not really seeking it that way. Right? So that's one way of thinking about what is God. This type of God doesn't have any attributes, no form. And in some ways, it's beyond the grasp of the mind. So when I started to think about it, it was very difficult for me. So there is this light, there is a consciousness, it's supposed to be within me. How do I achieve it, right? And I think that's because I'm not really that evolved. My practice is just beginning. And there are several sages in India and other parts of the world who are indeed in touch with their own pure consciousness. And this is often symbolized by the word Om. And when you say Om, there are certain vibrations that take place in your body that kind of center you and connect you with this pure consciousness. And that's why in Hinduism, the word Om is considered to be very, very auspicious. Okay, so you don't have the wherewithal to achieve or to look at God through this inner consciousness. Okay, you can do that through yoga, right? And in yoga, it is a concept of God which is also called Ishvara. This type of God has some sort of characteristics. It still doesn't have a form. It has some kind of a characteristic. It's all-knowing, all-powerful. So in a way, you could meditate on this God or Ishvara and still achieve the God without really understanding who that entity is. Finally, you could use a devotional anchor. And this, for many of us in the room, will be the most familiar form of how Hinduism is practiced or how Hindus see God. And Ishtadeva is your favorite God. That's what it means. So even though we feel that Hinduism has many gods, it is actually, the belief is that there is just one God, but you use different forms to focus your attention. And to many human beings, myself included, this is a more easier way to begin the practice of Hinduism and most popular way all over the world. And the reason is because a personal relationship with God, you have to have something to focus on. It is usually an idol, it is maybe a picture. Nowadays people look at things on the internet and pray that way. So we are evolving with the times. But this kind of devotion is very much a permissible part of the Hinduism practice, where you say that you have a form and you anchor your focus on that particular form. And there are stories about this. There are stories about gods. There are, you may have heard about gods like Lord Rama, Krishna is another god in the Hindu tradition. And so you feel that God can take a human form. And they have symbolic meaning. For instance, the elephant god or Ganesha in Hinduism symbolizes auspiciousness. So before we start any function, we pray to Ganesha. I remember when I was growing up in India and I would have an exam, I would run off to the Ganesha temple to pray. right? So this is a way to focus our concentration and our practice in one form. And it's interesting because in this you can see that Ganesha, the elephant, has a big head. So the symbolism is that you have to think big. The eyes are very small. The symbolism that is you concentrate. He has a mouse as his ride, if you will. And the mouse symbolizes desire, because if you don't control your desire, you can cause havoc, and so on and so forth. So there is every part of the form that is got a certain meaning, and as a human being who wants to practice Hinduism, if you're not able to go to the ultimate Brahman or your inner consciousness, no problem. If you're not able to do yoga, that's still okay. If you want to think of a particular form and focus your concentration and prayer, that is still all right. So I hope I have communicated a few things about Hinduism. We started off with the role of how our present status is. We are human beings who desire material wealth. We are human beings who desire pleasures of the senses. But we said that a way to conquer them is by understanding the right things to do and by doing things in a particular way, dharma and karma. And we have 4 ways or yoga or disciplines, either by doing things in a right way, by accumulating knowledge, by the physical practice of yoga and meditation, or by devotion. We are ultimately seeking moksha, and that is the state of pure consciousness, and it is characterized by a clear and calm mind. I'd like to end with a few pictures. So just for you to get a context of how Hinduism is practiced, it is practiced all over the world. If you think it's only practiced in India, that is incorrect. There are Hindus all over the world, including the United States, the Caribbean, Africa. It is a vibrant religion. This is a picture of a Hindu temple. This particular temple was built in the 6th century AD, and it is still a functioning temple in the south of India. And we visited this temple with our family last year. And this is another temple, almost looks like a Buddhist temple, right? But this is another example of a temple in the southern part of India as well. So I'm going to stop there, and we can certainly address some of the questions or comments that were raised during question and answer. Thank you.
We now proceed to our next speaker, the speaker on Jainism, Mr. Vipani.
Thank you, Dr. Heber, Dr. Moon, and all organizers of the event. Can you please start the presentation? Okay, why do we follow a religion? We all have different ambitions, different goal in our life. But if we try to find a common thread between all of those, we can simply summarize that we all want to be and remain happy. In simple form, and that too, what we prefer is anxiety or tension-free happiness. How Jainism helps in achieving our common goal. Jainism basically does not, or God in Jainism does not give any reward or any punishment. God in Jainism simply shows path to source of happiness. In Jainism, truly eternal happiness comes from within, that is from the soul. How Jainism helps in identifying soul out of various objects. and body in this universe. If we have to identify something in our day-to-day life, say for example, if we have to identify a real diamond from bunch of artificial diamonds or glass pieces cut into similar size and shape, what do we need to know? First of all, we need to know characteristics of real diamond, and we need to know few of basic characteristics of glass pieces, so that we don't take glass pieces by mistake as real diamond. So we need to know characteristics of those objects. So with that in mind, to identify soul, Jainism basically describes characteristics, capabilities, and state, different state or form of all objects. Again, to repeat, here the target is not to become living encyclopedia of all objects in universe, but to identify and experience our own soul. As we are talking about soul with respect to all religion, we know that all religion accepts existence of soul. But the differences are how soul and body are linked together, what are capabilities of each of these two, and more interestingly, what happens when a person dies or a soul departs from body. So Jainism basically classifies or introduces soul as an individual. By individual, it means that it is not part or piece of any single universal or omnipresent entity. Each soul is a separate entity in itself. It is independent. By that I mean that soul does not need any other object for its existence as well as survival. And the third major characteristic, it's eternal. As we all accept, basically soul has existed from beginningless time, and it will always exist in future. Next important aspect in soul, for soul, every living being from a plant cell or bacteria or a human being has a soul. The combined existence of a soul and body is governed by karma theory, as Dr. Sivaram mentioned about karma theory in Hinduism. There are little bit minute differences, but I'm not going in that individual detail as of now. But as per Jainism, soul and karma are attached together from eternity because of soul's wrong belief and ignorance of itself, and our inner passions, whether it's positive like worship, donation, ability or desire to help others, or we talk about negative like anger, greed, deceit, all those. So as per Jainism, karma are smallest physical particle in universe. It has physical characteristics like other physical particle, but soul does not have any such physical characteristic which can be used to identify using any physical instrument. So in that case, basically, how do we identify a soul? As I described earlier, that in our normal day-to-day life, if we have to identify something, we need to know about that object's characteristics. So one of the primary or prime characteristics of soul is knowledge or consciousness. So this knowledge itself knows and experience existence of soul as a separate entity from body. Second important aspect in this regard or characteristic is like faith, perception or belief. For example, like if a person knows that smoking is bad for his health, but that person will not take any action unless he believes in it. So that belief will change his conduct. So the second aspect or second basically characteristic or the way we identify knowledge is belief. With this, knowing and believing in true nature of self, means soul, and other object around soul constitutes the first step towards our ultimate goal. As I briefly introduce conduct by giving that example, code of conduct in Jainism is based on these 5 vows. The name almost similar as Dr. Sivaram introduced in Hinduism. So I can use the original word or Jain terminology: ahimsa, satya, achorya, brahmacharya and aparigraha. From one aspect, this list seems a relatively long list, and in our practical life it feels or it seems hard to follow. But I will try to show how, with true understanding of very core 2 basic concepts of Jainism, following all these vows becomes very easy or like normal way of life. Before I move to next slide, basically these vows are common for laymen, with family, businessmen, or even with saint. The differences are, as a person grows in spiritual level, intensity of these vows goes to higher stage. Non-violence or ahimsa. Non-violence in Jainism is based on equality. All souls are equal from fundamental characteristics point of view. Whether a soul in insect or animal, that soul can be a human in past, it can be a human in future, and achieve liberation or become a god as per Jainism. So sound understanding of this concept will naturally lead one to believe that, naturally lead one to respect all other living beings and care not to hurt them. So which is nothing but non-violence. Other important very basic concept of Jainism, as I said in beginning of this presentation itself, that truly eternal happiness comes from within. For that, I don't need any sensual pleasure or I don't need to collect material wealth. So if a person has sound understanding of this concept, he will not keep on collecting wealth. If it's coming to him based on his past good deed, that's a different thing. But that person will not get attached to it. So this is the concept of non-attachment or aparigraha. The other 3 vows, truthfulness, non-stealing and chastity, those comes as byproduct. By saying byproduct, I don't mean to reduce its importance even by a bit, but I am trying to simplify or how it becomes easy to follow, and it comes as a natural way if we understand those 2 core concepts. One, all souls are equal, and eternal happiness comes from within. So if a person believes in these 2 concepts, that person will not steal, lie or cheat for any of those kind of sensual pleasure or material wealth. So which is nothing but those 3 vows is also coming naturally into his life. So sometimes because of our weakness in these beliefs, if these thoughts comes to our mind, the person will immediately, sooner or later, realize that that was his mistake and will be more vigilant in future about those kind of negative thought or even action. So stronger this belief, very less occurrence of those kind of negative thoughts or action. So to summarize, as we just talk about these 2 core concepts, with these 2 core concepts, following of Jain code of conduct becomes a natural way of life. It does not feel like an imposed rule. As I also talked about 3 aspects of recognizing soul: knowledge, perception, and conduct. So these 3 are considered in its right form, considered as 3 gems: right perception, right knowledge, and right conduct. These 3 together constitutes path of liberation in Jainism. So just to summarize again, each soul is individual, independent, and eternal. Each soul can become God through self-realization and meditation of self. So in this way, we can summarize Jainism as a scientific way of life. So I am basically including science, because in science, normally we try to identify objects and put that knowledge into best use. So here, Jainism as an eternal science, we use it to realize true ourself based on fundamental characteristics of the soul and other object. So that way it is a science, and we can put that scientific knowledge into practical life by respecting self-sufficiency and independence of every living being and surrounding objects while coexisting with others. With this, thank you so much.
We shall now take a break, and then we will have the 4 remaining religions after that. Tea is served and snacks are served at the back of the room, so please help yourself. So we are on break right now for 15 minutes. That's it. We will now have our presentation on Zoroastrianism by Mr. Shroff.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kersi Shroff. I'm a member of the Zoroastrian Association of Washington, which is a group of Zoroastrians who arrived in North America since the 1960s and 70s. And they're living in Northern Virginia and Maryland and in Washington, D.C. A very little known faith. So thank you, Dr. Moon, for inviting me, for somebody, faith that's normally not represented amongst the major faiths in the world. And Professor Heber, when he asked me, I said, why are you including this? And of course, he invited our priest, Brigadier Behram Panthaki, to come and talk about it. But Brigadier Panthaki was busy, so he asked me. So my apologies if I don't fulfill the bill. I'm just a layman talking about a subject in which I've grown up, but I'm not a scholar. So Zoroastrianism is an ancient faith, as it's said. And when I first was asked the question, and it's not well known in the West, when I was first asked the question, what is your faith? And I said Zoroastrianism, people had a quizzical look on their face. What do you mean? So somebody told me that I think they're confusing you with... But I said, I'm not as swashbuckling as this person. So anyway, it's been a while now, and now I think over the years the knowledge has, we are part of the Interfaith Conference and other interfaith activities, so it's becoming well known. So what is Zoroastrianism? Zoroastrianism is based on the prophet Zarathustra, but the Greeks called them Zoroaster. So I'm going to continue, for simplicity's sake, continue to say Zoroaster, but the actual name is Zarathustra, which you may have come across in literature and other events. In Farsi, in Persian, which is Iran is the home country of Zoroastrianism, is also called Zardush. I found this characterization in a modern rendition of the prophet to be quite appealing. It says, Zoroaster, in the book called In Search of Zarathustra, the subtitle of the book is The First Prophet and the Ideas That Changed the World. Now, why is that so? Because Zoroaster lived about 3,700 years ago, but he propounded some profound principles which have survived to this present day. The time of Zoroaster is debated, but it's generally about 37 years ago. And he was a rebel. He grew up as a priest in the community, what was called the Mazda Yasmin community, but he rebelled against all the rituals and all the other events that were taking place and considered to be Zoroastrianism. So he went into exile and meditated, and he's supposed to have received a divine message from God, in which he expressed in scriptures called the Gathas. The Gathas are divine hymns. Not all of them have survived, but the 5 that have survived provide profound principles. Now, the place of his meanderings before he declared himself as a prophet was somewhere in Central Asia, and the scriptures mention regions like Margiana, Sogdiana, Bactria, which are in present-day Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and northern part, Bactria being in northern part of Afghanistan. So this is the region I'm talking about generally, in this area here. And then the faith eventually migrated to Iran itself. All these lands were formerly Iranian lands. They're called Eastern Iranian lands. The culture was the same, the language was the same. So when Zoroastrianism came west here, there was a fight between the Persians and the Medes, and the Persians prevailed, and the Persians adopted Zoroastrianism as their faith. And it went through 3 Persian empires, in which Zoroastrianism finally, in the 3rd empire of the Sassanians, it became the official faith of Iran. This is the region, and it spread, as you can see, far and wide. It goes up to the Indus River in India, Pakistan, right up to Lydia, goes to Greece. So it covered a wide tract. So what are the beliefs in Zoroastrianism? The first and foremost is a belief in one God. Now we're talking about 3,700 years ago, when there were polytheistic faiths and so forth. And here is a faith that declares one God called Ahura Mazda, called the Wise Lord. And that makes Zoroastrianism amongst the Abrahamic faiths as one of the first faiths to declare monotheism. In his teaching, Zoroaster mentioned that mankind itself has all the divine attributes of God. And the emphasis was on the mental element, that you've been endowed with a brain, and that is why you should be leading a good life, struggling against, working on behalf of good, struggling against evil. The conflict between good and evil is a major concept of Zoroastrianism, which has been followed later on as well. And Zoroaster was extremely interested in establishing order over chaos in the world. The era was, I think, the start of the Bronze Age, and there were armaments and chariots and so forth, and he railed against them. And the other major teaching was that we're here to renovate this world. We must leave this world in a better state than what we found it in. So that is called the progressive world, and that leads us to strive towards perfection, individually and for the universe. As I said, Zoroaster's revelations were made in an oral tradition. The gathas were conveyed orally for many centuries, and the 5 of them have these major principles. The first gatha talks about truth, wisdom, and love, and how they should prevail. Under its 7 chapters, the prophet pledges to remove darkness, selfishness, violence, and to establish light, selflessness, and love, features that have been talked about by other faiths as well. The second gatha teaches mankind a life of altruism, living for others, happiness unto him who provides happiness unto others. That's a theme that comes out of the second gatha. Put yourself after you put others first. The third gatha embodies the Spirit of God, recognizing in everyone the presence of the good Spirit, and teaching love, consideration for others, and avoiding misunderstandings and violence. Fourth gatha defines moral power, and that power and morality must always go hand in hand. The fifth gatha gives the meaning of how to achieve fulfillment in life in which truth prevails. The photo happens to be that of a Avesta, that's the Cyrillic language, a Russian version of the Bible, of the Avesta. I have a book in English which anyone's interested, I'll be happy to show them. So, to give you an example of 2 gathas. Gatha number 3 in one of the chapters says, O God, how great is thy power. Deeply do I yearn to serve humanity, O Mazda, with good deeds. I wish to be one with thee through truth, pure mind, helping the poor and needy, and protecting thy meek. We regard thee, O Lord, above all, apart from the Daivas, which are the false gods and wicked persons. This is a translation provided by a Mubid, a priest in Iran. The Avesta language is not extant. Only a small group of people have studied it and understand it. So it's something that needs a lot of learning. Second example, and this is a main feature of Zoroastrianism. Hear with your ears the highest truths, and with an illumined mind, weigh them with care before you choose which of 2 paths, good or evil, to tread. This is the concept of free choice. You have the good mind. You are responsible for using that good mind to decide what path you are going to take in life, good or evil. It's your individual choice that is important in that regard. And you decide man by man and wake up alert to spread Ahura Mazda's words. So, the concept of individual responsibility is extremely important in the Gathas. According to one scholar, this concept was revolutionary for its time because religious commitment is viewed as an act of individual reflection, choice, and active dedication. The consequence of which is the unavoidable individual responsibility before God for a worthy life and for the foundation of personal salvation. That is the message, I think, that the first slide that I show you, the ideas that changed the world, this is one of the concepts that traveled through the ages. Mankind also has the divine attributes, as I said. Those are good thoughts and a good mind, having righteousness and having an established order and living in this world, having the choice you freely make to follow the path that you decide upon with devotion and humility, perfection and spiritual wholeness and immortality. Now these are also called Amesha Spentas, and the Reverend Father who spoke about saints and so forth, I think there is some thinking that these are the basis on which saintly virtues were described by Zarathustra. These values and virtues are reflected in the Zoroastrian calendar. I've just given you the names of the first 7 days. So it starts with the day of the Lord, and the second day is for the good mind, third for truth, the fourth for desired power, devotion, perfection, immortality, and it goes on for all 30 days. And the days of the month also reflect those characteristics. Ardibesh Kodar is another word for Hormas, and there are several deities and virtues represented in those names. And interestingly enough, in present-day Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the months continue to be referred to from the Zoroastrian calendar. In terms of the scriptures, I spoke of the Gathas, the oral tradition. The oral tradition had to be reduced into writing, and that helped Zoroastrians later on, because when Islam came to Iran, only the people who had a book, Din Ilahi, or people who had a kitab, who had a book, were recognized. So to that extent, Zoroastrians were protected when Islam came to Iran. So the religious texts include many important ceremonies, and these were codified during the Sasanian period, which was the last kingdom of Iran before the arrival of Islam. The codification is called the Younger Avesta to denote the fact that the Gathas are the original Avesta, and this was added later on. And there are many rituals and so forth. You have to pray 5 times a day. There are 4 holy days in the month. And at the end of the year, there are 5 days called the Days of the Gathas, in which the recitation of the Gathas is decreed. And then there are ceremonial occasions at each season, like a Thanksgiving for harvest and so forth, which are called Jashans, to thank Ahura Mazda for all the blessings and the bounties received by mankind. There are individual ceremonies as well. There is what is called a Sudre Pushi, or a Naujot, which means a young person is initiated into the Zoroastrian faith upon his or her agreement to do so. And so generally around puberty, the youth is invested with a sacred shirt, which is a white muslin shirt, and a woolen thread, which is wound around the waist 3 times to denote good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Here's a ceremony of the Sudre Pushi, where this woolen thread is invested on young people, and there's a white thread. And the white thread has a symbolic pocket at the top. And that pocket is supposed to represent the good deeds that you are to do in this world. Going back to personal ceremonies, a wedding ceremony also recites the very thoughts expressed by Zarathustra when he gave his daughter in marriage. There are funeral services in which you say your prayers for the person to be accepted into paradise. Paradise is a concept which comes from a Persian word, paradis, I believe, and that on the basis of the person's good deeds, the soul should be received in paradise. And there's a very graphic description of how, when a person has done good deeds, there's a bridge called the Chinvat Pool, which opens up wide, and the person is welcomed into paradise. If your deeds have not been of the expected standard, then the bridge narrows down and you fall into some sort of darkness. The significance of the soul is very important in Zoroastrianism. So at the end of each year, at the 5 days of the Gathas, all the departed ones are praised and prayed for, so that they continue to remain in paradise. One other major ceremony of the Zoroastrians is called Nowruz, New Year, which is the spring equinox. It starts roughly on either March 20th or 21st, called Nowruz. And the Zoroastrians used to have a ceremony which recognized the 7 good elements of the earth. You know, there was fruit, there were eggs, there were even wine, which was called sharab, but then it later became sharbat, and flowers and so forth. These are called the 7 creations of our Mazda, and they're laid in a symbolic form on a table decorated like this at each Nowruz. Nowruz is celebrated, by the way, in a large swath of the Near East, Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, so forth. So it's a worldwide celebration on the 21st of March. And it goes back to the Zoroastrian roots. Even in present-day Iran, there is they take holiday for 7 days. Unfortunately, after the end of the Persian empires, Zoroastrianism suffered a great decline. Only small groups of Zoroastrians eventually migrated to India, where they were received by a Hindu Raja. They were allowed to settle in India. The Zoroastrian community that survived in Iran faced great discrimination, and they also had to pay a special tax called the jizya. The present number, but times have changed, and the present number of Zoroastrians is not that many, probably under 200,000. In India, Pakistan, between 60 and 70,000. In Iran, between 30 and 40,000. And now, of course, in the West, in the last 4 or 5 decades. Fortunately for the Iranian Zoroastrians, because they're a people of the book, the Constitution of Iran recognizes the Zoroastrian faith. So the Zoroastrians in Iran are protected by the Constitution, which has been a very wonderful thing for them. Miscellaneous items about Zoroastrianism. If any of you have studied law, if you read the French Napoleonic Code, in its introduction it mentions major legal systems, mentions major civilizations. The Avesta is mentioned there as called the laws of Zardusht. There was a German philosopher, you've all heard of him, Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote a book called Das Sprach Zarathustra, which he took this concept of good and evil and distorted it somewhat into a super being and in history, the first Achaemenian king of the Persians was Cyrus the Great, and when he conquered Babylonia, there were Jews held in captivity by the Babylonian kings. He set them free, and he subsidized them to go to Jerusalem to build their first temple. So the concept of Cyrus was, I will conquer you, you will probably pay taxes to me, but I will not impose my own religion on you. You are free to practice your faith in the way. And that's what led him to the liberation of the Jews, and that's why I believe in the Old Testament, Cyrus is recognized as the anointed one for having done that. In the Quran, in the Holy Quran, Zoroastrians are mentioned, but they're called Majus, Majus being the Magi. The Magi are the one who are supposed to have come to give their blessings to the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. In India and Pakistan, the Zoroastrians who settled down there over the centuries became known as the Parsis, Parsis being having come from the region of Pars in Persia. And they had their own separate laws, laws of divorce, laws of marriage, laws of adoption, and so forth. In North America, we have now over 30 close to 30 organized communities, which means there are pockets of Zoroastrians in New York, in Chicago, in Houston, in Vancouver, California, and so forth, and they're all organized under a federation of Zoroastrian associations. Our priest, who was invited by Professor Hebert to come today, could not come because he's attending a meeting of the Zoroastrian priests in New Jersey. After having been here 30 years in the Washington area, we have strived mightily to build a center for us. Finally, a few years back, a great benefactor came forward and he donated this center for us. We just opened it 3 years ago. It's called the Kamran Dar Mer. It's in Boyds, Maryland, which is about, all of you know Gaithersburg. It's about 5 to 10 miles from Gaithersburg. This was the ceremony that we had when we opened the Zoroastrian Center in Boyds 3 years ago. And that's Mobet Pantaki, who was supposed to be here, doing the initiation ceremony. And there's a photo of our founder, Mr. Khudamarat Kamran, who donated a large segment of the funds required for the building the temple. Another happy event happened just a couple of months ago. We opened a new temple in New York, in Pomona, New York. And that temple is, the design of that temple is based on one that exists in Yazd, Iran. And this is the ceremony that took place in March. The Zoroastrians consider fire to be a symbol of God. They've been vilified as fire worshippers, but it's the symbolism of God's presence on earth that is considered fire. So here the priests are wearing this mask over their face, which is called the padam, which means that when you're sitting in front of the fire, you don't pollute it with your breath. The padam, incidentally, is found in places in eastern China. Recent excavations in one of the provinces in China have found carvings and so forth of Zoroastrians who migrated to China after the end of the Sasanian Empire, and they set up shop there. And some of the priests are shown wearing this padam, which clearly indicates that these were Zoroastrians. I'm showing this to you on a personal basis. This is where I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan. There are 2 temples there. One of them is this, again based on Persepolis, going back to the Persian Empire. And you may have seen the symbol of the pharaoh Har, as it's called. It is very symbolic. It has many features in it. The 3 things that I could say about it is that it's pointing to one God. The 3 feathers depict the Zoroastrian credo of good thoughts, good words, good deeds. And the feathers represent the 72 chapters of the Zoroastrian scripture. Now, I happen to have gone to Central Asia, to the area that I showed you in the map earlier. I went to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, which have a very rich culture between the 5th and 17th centuries in the present era. And right there in Dushanbe, on a street, they have many paintings, and one of them was that Zarathustra, the first prophet, he meant, and it's a mistake, the first prophet Zoroaster of the Aryan people. I was shocked. I mean, I've never seen a painting of Zoroaster in a public, even in Iran you don't see it, or in India. So the thread of Zoroastrianism survives in Iran, even to the present day. Here's a popular singer by the name of Gugush. I wanted to play the song to you, but you don't have the internet available. She sings, "In my ancient, beautiful homeland, which is older than history, who decided that singing is a crime? Though Zoroaster fertilized this land with his songs." You can find it on the internet. This quote is from that book, In Search of Zarathustra. Now, this is the end of my presentation of Zoroastrianism, but I thought it appropriate, since you're opening your temple here and you're having ceremonies, to show you something that I found in Tajikistan. There's a monastery in southern Tajikistan called Ajina Tepe, in which they excavated, some years ago, they excavated this large Buddha. It is supposed to be the longest recumbent Buddha in the Nirvana posture. So after the excavations, they had to break it up into several pieces, and they brought it to the capital, and now it's held in the National Museum of Tajikistan. It was cut into about 14 pieces, and this gives you a little better picture of the size. 13 meters long, 2.70 meters high, and 6 tons in weight. It took them several years to find the head. Apparently the practice was to cut off the head, throw it away. And eventually they were able to find it together. I have a much better picture of it in a book if anybody is interested. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks, Juan. Yeah. Right. Now we will have Dr. Roby Roy to speak about Orthodox Christianity. Dr. Roy.
All right, thank you. And may I have the clicker, please? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. I think we're here, and we can put it into slideshow mode. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, and I'd like to really give a word of thanks to the Venerable Moon and Dr. Habar for inviting me to join this very, respected panel. I am Robbie Samanta Roy. I'm a layperson in St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Church in Fairfax, Virginia, and I am standing in for Father Anthony, who is actually the priest of St. Timothy's and St. Athanasius's Coptic Orthodox Church in Arlington, Virginia. So I'm a layperson, and I hope I will do a little bit of justice that Father Anthony could do for this very amazing topic. So I'm going to talk to you today about Orthodox Christianity, but with a specific flavor on Coptic Orthodoxy, which is Orthodox Christianity in Egypt. Next slide, please. And here's a brief overview of my chart. I'm going to talk to you what is Orthodox Christianity a little bit. Who are the Copts? Talk a little bit about the sacraments of Orthodox Christianity, which are very similar to Catholicism. Talk a little bit about, from a historical perspective, the importance of the Holy Family in Egypt, which is a very interesting historical tie. And then talk a little bit about the family tree and timeline of Christianity and where the Coptic Orthodox Church fits along that family tree with other elements and branches of Christianity. Talk a little bit about a historical perspective and some of the contributions of the Coptic Church overall to Christianity, and just say a few words about the Coptic Church today. So basically, the introduction to the Coptic Church. The Coptic Church is an apostolic Christian church, meaning when we say apostolic, it was founded by one of the apostles that was apostle of Christ. And in this case, it was St. Mark, the author of the second gospel. And he came to Egypt, in Alexandria, Egypt, in the basically 60 AD or so. And he brought Christianity and essentially, within a few number of years, developed the theology and the following of Christianity before his martyrdom. So the Coptic Church basically goes back to the early origins of the apostles of Christ. The word Coptic is derived from an ancient Greek word, Aegyptos, which means Egyptian. So Coptic just really means Egyptian. And it was a term, obviously, that the Greeks used to refer to those ancient Egyptians. And the word Orthodox is another ancient Greek word, which means the straight or true path, the straight opinion or right belief. So Coptic Orthodox just means it's the Egyptian branch of apostolic Christianity that believes in the straight, unchanging belief of Christianity from the time of Christ. And it is that we hold true to the teachings and practices of those early apostles. There's often a joke that is said about Orthodoxy, which is, how many Orthodox does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, there's no change. So, And one of the things that, so when we talk about Christianity and across all of the family of Christianity, the central beliefs of Coptic Orthodoxy, or of Orthodoxy in general, and actually even of many branches of Christianity, are expressed by the Nicene or the Constantinople Creed, which I'll say a few words of, that the Coptic Church was really played a central role in defining and authoring that. The other key thing is that we sometimes have to mention, although this is a bit of a very deep theological concept, the fact that the Coptic Church is not monophysite, which really means that there's a big theological debate way back in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Was the Coptic Church, did they believe in one nature of Christ or two natures of Christ? And it was whether he was divine or was he human. At the end, we believe that he was both human and divine. And so sometimes, I mean, if you look even in the Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll see this false claim that the Coptic Church is monophysite, but that is not true. And the Copts today are about 10 to 12% of Egypt's population, which is a little bit north of 80 million. But then again, there are Copts that are all around the world, including a very vibrant community here in Northern Virginia and the Maryland area. I'll say a few things about the major sacraments that are really tied up in terms of the beliefs of the Orthodox Church. Baptism, of course, one of the important things, the symbolism of baptism, which is where we basically we believe in child baptism, although those that are converted into the faith can be baptized as adults. But we have children that are baptized because the parents want them to believe, and it symbolizes the death and resurrection as symbolized in terms of Christ's death and resurrection. There's the chrismation, which is right after baptism, which is anointing of a holy oil, which is implying basically the Holy Spirit entering into that individual. There is the sacrament of marriage, the holy tradition of marriage, the anointing of the sick by oil. There's confession and repentance with the Father of Confession, which gets back to some of the themes we've heard earlier about making sure that individuals have purity and honesty and truthfulness, and anything that is wrong with us, we basically have a dialogue or confession with our Father of Confession. And there's obviously the Eucharist, which is communion. And it's associated with the liturgy, which is the major ceremony. I can say that as a ceremony, for instance, on a Sunday, or it can be on any day where the congregation partakes in the body and blood of Christ, which we call the Eucharist. And then there is the priesthood, which is also one of the major sacraments. There are the priests at the congregational level. One of the distinctions between Orthodoxy and in the Catholic tradition is that the priests have to be married before they're ordained. And then above the priests there are bishops, and right now there are about currently over 60 within the Coptic Orthodox Church, and they're organized along really two lines. Either they have a geographical area where they have to be responsible for, or they have a functional area that they're responsible for instance, education or youth or family matters, etc. And then chosen from the bishops or the monks is a patriarch who is the head of the Coptic Church. And really he's the first among equals. One of the things that the Coptic Church is very proud of is that after Christ was born, of course, in the Old Testament or the New Testament story, when Christ had to flee and his family had to flee into Egypt that he fled because he's been pursued by Herod. And this is really, in some sense, a fulfillment of, there's a lot of Old Testament prophecy. For instance, in Hosea and Isaiah, there's reference to Egypt, being blessed be Egypt, my people. Out of Egypt have I called you. And there's all this prophecy that there is going to be something very important that was going to happen in Egypt. And so archaeologists and a lot of tradition have actually traced out the path that the Holy Family took, which really came from up here, from Bethlehem, all the way down. It was a journey that took almost 3 years and covered over 2,000 kilometers into the central southern part of Egypt and traced himself all the way back. And you can find here along the way, there's various monasteries, there's various trees, and it's not only in the Christian tradition, it's actually even local Muslim communities have this tradition that this is some place where Christ as a child and his Holy Family stayed. So it is a very interesting journey. You can imagine that they didn't understand the language. It was a very harsh, environment that they went into, but it is something that the Coptic Church is very proud of in terms of that association with the Holy Family. One of the interesting things is that obviously after the time of Christ, during those first few centuries, the whole Mediterranean basin was essentially where Christianity developed, and there were a number of very important intellectual centers. There was obviously Alexandria, based upon that deep, historical, intellectual center from the Greek tradition. There's obviously Jerusalem, there is Antioch, all around within the, basically the Mediterranean basin all the way up to Rome. And this was essentially the very early period of Christianity when theology was being formed and all of Christianity was basically one family or one body of Christ. And due to the fact that there's this rich intellectual tradition by the Greeks in Alexandria, the Coptic Church really played a very important theological perspective in the development of early Christian theology. Here's a brief outline of our timeline of Christianity. I'd like to point out here, from the time of Christ or the New Testament era, all of Christianity was basically what was known as one holy universal apostolic church. And there are a number of very formative councils where all of the leaders of Christianity basically came together and developed, if you will, the formative doctrine and the theology and the beliefs of Christianity. The councils of Nicaea, where the Nicene Creed was formalized, Constantinople, Ephesus. And unfortunately, there was a lot of politics. Of course, you can imagine different languages, a lot of different historical backgrounds, etc., going on. And it was unfortunately at the mid, of that first millennium in 451, the Council of Chalcedon, where there was a misunderstanding between two branches of the Orthodox churches. And there was this split. So to this day, they are known as the Chalcedonian Eastern Orthodox churches and the non-Chalcedonian, the Oriental Orthodox churches. So the ones that are Chalcedonian are the ones that are known as like the Greek churches, the Russian churches, the Serbian churches, etc. And the Oriental Orthodox churches it's the Coptic Church, it's the Indian Church, it's the Ethiopian Church. There's a number of all these churches that have their ethnic traditions, but ultimately from a doctrinal and a theological perspective, there is no difference. And what has been happening over the last number of years, there has been some interactions across the clergy to basically understand these deep-seated, long historical misunderstandings and say, at the end of the day, we believe in the same thing. Why aren't we really together as one family of Christ? Now, the same thing applies, at the end of the first millennium in 1054. There was a great schism that took place between really the Eastern and the Western churches. And the Roman Catholic Church then sort of basically split. There was a split in the family, so to speak. And even though there fundamentally are still many of the same things that are the same, there were some fundamental things that caused that diversion or the division. And then obviously moving into the 16th and the 17th centuries was then essentially you had the formation of the Protestant Reformation and a lot of these other churches that split off. But what the family of Orthodox churches likes to point out is that ultimately we have maintained that early faith, and we had nothing that has really changed fundamentally from those early beliefs and practices from the time of Christ. From a historical perspective, I like to put together a few things from an outline perspective. Obviously, these are sort of the major, if you will, epochs or eras of Christianity in Egypt. There was the establishment of Christianity in Egypt, obviously, through the time of 312 AD with Emperor Constantine, when actually Christianity was actually formalized. It was legalized. It was actually legalized. Before that, it was heavily persecuted. Through 431 was essentially that golden era of the Church of Alexandria, where the theologians, St. Athanasius, in fact, we talk about, I loved Father Don's speech this morning. He talked about the importance of the communion of saints. Well, today we are actually celebrating the feast, if you will, of St. Athanasius, who is essentially the one who put the canon of the Bible together. The ordering of the Bible, the Christian Bible, is basically put together by St. Athanasius, and he was also the author of the Nicene Creed. And it was during that golden era, if you will, that the Church of Alexandria had a huge impact across Christendom. But then things started to subsequently decline after that due to a lot of the politics and the divisions. In the 7th century, there was the Islamic invasion, and Christianity then became heavily persecuted. There are whole oscillating periods of various foreign invaders and rulers over the country, and that's sometimes known as basically the Dark Ages of the Coptic tradition, until basically when the European invasions came, which was a whole other invasion timeline, if you will, in that period of the world. But in some sense, it led to a Coptic emancipation in the fact that there was more a general freedom of all religions and a tax, very similar to what the Zoroastrians were paying. It's called the jizya. That was being paid at that time, was actually abolished by the British. And then, of course, we have the Coptic Church today. A few other things in terms of the history and the contributions. As I had mentioned earlier, it's St. Mark, one of the authors of the Gospel, who came and preached in Egypt. And he was, obviously really made an impact. Over 8 years, he brought to Christianity, and then within that short amount of time, it became actually the dominant majority religion in Egypt. And then obviously during the early church time period, there was extreme persecution under the Roman Empire. And in fact, the Coptic calendar starts in the year 284, which coincides to when there was an enormous martyrdom that had taken place during the time of Diocletian, who was the Roman emperor and was really known for his brutality against Christianity. Obviously, the early church fathers that were associated with that theological school of Alexandria that I talked about really played an important role in terms of essentially defining the theology of Christianity. And St. Athanasius also really played an important role in defending the actual divinity of Christ from a theological perspective. And again, as I had mentioned, those three early church councils were very important in the formulation of Christian theology, and the Coptic Church played a very important defining role, especially in combating some of these early, what we called heresies, which were essentially deviations from the original doctrine and theology and the belief in Christ. One of the other interesting things is we've heard about how other faiths have had really interesting going way back, thousands of years, the importance of monasticism. And I really like that Father Don this morning basically talked about St. Anthony and basically monasticism, the role that monasticism played within Egypt, and how it really brought monasticism to Christianity. So this is obviously a movement that flourished from the 4th century, and you can still see, there's a few examples here, relics of Coptic monks in Ireland. In fact, Father John showed a picture this morning of a view from a monastery. St. Moritz, who was a Copt in the Roman Theban Legion, she brought Christianity to Switzerland. So anybody who goes skiing in St. Moritz, it's amazing that this influence is spread all the way from Egypt across Europe. And today now, many of these famous Coptic monasteries are located in this region that is between Cairo and Alexandria. So if you ever visit between those two cities, you'll find a lot of these monasteries. For instance, the Abu Makar Monastery and the Al-Baramos Monastery. Just as an interesting historical aside, this area here called Wadi el-Natrun was actually an area where the ancient pharaonic Egyptians took a lot of the various minerals and other things like that to actually help in the embalming of the ancient pharaohs. So it's also very interesting from a geological perspective. This is an example of one of the early churches, the Al-Mu'aka church, the hanging church. It's called hanging because it's built over a wall in the old sort of Roman section of Cairo. And the original building goes back to the 3rd and 4th century, but the actual building itself now dates back to the 7th century. So it's a very interesting architectural construct that one can still visit in Cairo today. A few other things that I've sort of touched upon from a Coptic history and contributions perspective. We talked about the fact of the Islamic invasion of Egypt in 641 and what that did in terms of the community, discrimination, and etc. like that. And then essentially that tax on non-Muslims was abolished in 1854. And then one of the important things, it took all the way until the 1960s when Pope Carolus, or St. Cyril, who was the patriarch, really led a revival in the Coptic community, reinvigorated the theological school, the monasteries. He led to basically the spread of a catechism and a Sunday school curriculum across basically the Copts that had spread around the world by then, and was very important to sort of reinvigorating the spiritual and the theological spark, if you will, of the church. And in 1968, so this is something that's not just Copts, but many Egyptians knew about, was the apparitions of St. Mary in Zaytun, which is one of the suburbs of Cairo that happened in 1968. And so this was actually a picture of that church in St. Mary's Church in Zaytun. And it's interesting, there are some journalists in a paper that had taken some pictures of of some. This was the image of Saint Mary that was claimed to have appeared at Saint Mary's Church in Zaytun, and it was reflective of the fact that there was this reinvigoration of the church, and it was really a good sign for all that that basically the church had been brought back to life. A couple of the other interesting things is the Coptic language. A few things about that. The Coptic language per se is no longer a vernacular. It's a little bit like a Sanskrit or other languages where it's really only used in essentially a liturgical sense. But it is essentially the use of a modified Greek alphabet to pronounce the ancient hieroglyphs. So basically the Rosetta Stone that was used to decipher the hieroglyphs really had ancient Greek, it had Coptic, and it had the hieroglyphs. So it was really, if you will, a translation language to understand what the hieroglyphs were. Some of the famous Coptic saints, obviously, as the Orthodox Church really believes also in terms of the communion of the saints and individuals that really made a significant impact and that we want to basically emulate to their lives and their examples that they led for us to be more Christ-like. And so a number of them, I won't go through all the great details, but obviously St. Mark from the beginning who established Christianity, St. Athanasius who defended the faith, St. Cyril, who's a very powerful theologian, all the way down to even the modern St. Cyril VI, who was really, basically Pope Carolus, in Coptic called Pope Carolus, who was a saint and became the patriarch, really revived the modern Coptic Church. And it's interesting, in the Coptic liturgy, there is a document called the Coptic Synaxarium, which is essentially a compendium of all the history of all the various, not just Coptic, but all, even the early Christianity, the martyrs and the saints. And it is a really powerful document that at a liturgical basis, it reminds you of those individuals that played a very important role in keeping the faith and advancing the faith and being a guiding light for us to be more Christ-like. The Coptic Church today, this is our current patriarch, the 118th patriarch, Pope Tawadros II, and he is now the leader. He's located in Cairo, but spends a lot of time also within Alexandria. And the Coptic population, I said, has been obviously a significant fraction of the current population in Egypt, but there's also well over 100 churches that have been spread around the world. And one of the things that we still have to remember is and I really liked the fact that was mentioned this morning, that we had an Indian Buddhist professor teaching a Muslim from Egypt about Christianity and how it can only happen in America, and that we should really be proud of the fact that we're having this interfaith event here in America, which really believes in freedom of religion, and that as we speak today, there are many of our co-religionists that are actually being persecuted for their faith. And that is still something that happens actually in Egypt today, which is something that is very unfortunate. So with that really concludes my presentation, and I look forward to any questions in the question and answer period. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Right, thanks. Yeah, right. Now we'll have Chaplain Johnson, who will talk about the Protestant Christianity, specifically the Baptist tradition. Chaplain.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hobar and our Venerable Mon, for this occasion and other distinguished panelists. My role as a chaplain is to engage college students and occasionally graduate students in exploring and connecting their faith to the transformation of this world, to help them to connect their faith with social justice. And I think this is a wonderful time to discuss this briefly. Firstly, when students leave home to college, they leave the religious influence of their parents. The best hope you can have is that the seed that you planted will not be watered and will prosper. But the fact of the matter is, when many college students go away from home, they often would say, bye to the religious influences of our parents. This is, for some of them, the first step to religious freedom. It is actually freedom from your religion. But this is a time for exploration, because they will now enter a context wherein other students will question their faith more than ever before. I remember one occasion, a student who in fact is graduating this year from GW, in fact today, came from the Southwest. And for the very first time, she said, when she came during the first year, at our meetings, she literally cried. Because students with whom I was working in an interfaith social justice project did not only question, but they were very, very critical of the mere fact that she had a faith to which to refer, a frame of reference. So most of the history and the theology and the ethics are frames of reference that we hope our children will reflect upon and be informed by. Because the larger context in which your college students are, if I may say the truth, at least for the community that I serve, the Protestant quote-unquote community, there is simply no frame of reference. And thanks be unto God for the Catholic Newman Centers, where college students can come in and be a part of a community of faith. They have chaplains and campus ministers to wish to reinforce their belief, and they have regular services of mass to which they can go. In fact, studies have shown that the Catholics do much better in terms of reaching out and connecting to college students through the Newman Centers across the United States. For us Protestants, we are very, very fragmented. So the first issue is, how can we as a faith group whose worldview is informed by our historical faith can in fact reach out to and include college students within our communities, no matter what they are? Whether they are Catholics, Jewish, Buddhists, Hindus, Coptic. That's the first question for me as a chaplain. The first challenge is the source. What is it that informs college students once they come in? Is it the tradition that we describe here? And I will say, probably not. It's the internet. The news media is the first frame of reference for our college students. If they have questions, they go on the internet, not the priests, not the campus ministers. Their colleagues are their spiritual guides. So they will most likely ask another friend, roommate, rather than a professor of theology. They will ask them, because that's how the world is. So how do we then organize and connect our ministries in such a way so that our inquiries will be available to respond to young people whose worldview we parents have worked towards in cultivating? So that most of our students, rather than going to the internet for a source of information, can contact pastors, ministers, priests who are familiar with the tradition and understand the ethical heritage that has been passed on from one faith group or one tradition onto us. That's the first question. One of the ways that I, as a chaplain, have found that, and by the way, let me just digress quickly to say, even though at George Washington University, I had served on the Board of Chaplains for many years, as far back as 2000. Let me also digress here to say that our Board of Chaplains had been dissolved in about 2004. So hopefully, the Board of Chaplains is going to be reconstituted not too many months from now. And I think that's a great opportunity for all the priests and ministers here to see how we can collaborate during this phase. Let me go back quickly. One of the reasons why I'm interested in interfaith is because I myself grew up Christian in a Muslim household. My dad went to an Episcopal school, a Presbyterian church, and he said, well, there is such a distortion between the text and the example of the community. I would rather embrace Islam because the Islamic community it lives its life much more in line with the text. On the other hand, he said, I will give you the freedom to choose which faith you're going to subscribe to. So quite early in 3rd grade, when I went to church, I made sure I had a pen and a paper. Because when I got home, my dad is going to ask me 4 questions. What was the text? Do you have an outline? Did you understand the sermon? Can you give me a summary? And then he will take the Quranic text and have me to understand the difference. That was unusual. I have never seen any family in my entire life who has done that. But do you know, my father, therefore, even though he was an engineer, he was my first theologian. So when we go to the juvenile jail in Washington, D.C., next to Gallaudet University, in fact, I have a lot of Muslims who are involved with us. And at the reflection session, once we leave the cell blocks called the pods, and ask these college students, we give them the topic ahead of time. We ask them, go and read your Quran. I'll read my New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. And you come in, after you've taught the subject, and among ourselves, we will have a conversation comparing the text as they are, without commentaries, just the text, to help our students understand the Islamic text and the Christian New Testament. I found that to be useful. Now, so how can we engage our students? I find it very challenging to invite college students to a prayer meeting. This is not meditation. Just together to pray. Protestant students, they understand and recognize the need for prayer. But it should be someone else's responsibility. Let the mother pray for them. Let the priest pray for them. But they are only occasionally, they will always pray. Final exams are coming. And especially today when they graduate, when is the next job coming? During those times, it's easy to have them to get involved in the practice of prayer. But what do we do as people of faith whose worldview is informed by the faith traditions? Number one, understand that our college students and young adults are pragmatic. They are more interested in solving problems, not through prayer and meditation, as perhaps we might think, but rather they want to be personally involved in solving problems and engaging in social justice. So the question for us here is, what do we have in place to engage our students and therefore reflect. In other words, the traditional mode has been reading this text, reflecting upon the text, and then within the context of the community, seeing how we can solve problems, perhaps primarily for purposes of conversion. I'm not saying that conversion is wrong. I want to be very clear, because each of us in here will preach our faith in others for others to come and be a part of our community. Within the context of religious freedom, that's perfectly okay. But students sometimes will call us into question if that is our only motive. If that's our only motive, they will question us. And believe it or not, as a Baptist minister, that's what the first question they ask me. Are you more interested in my conversion so that you can add me as a number in your statistics? I say, here's the good news. I don't have any statistics. So, how do we engage our young adults into social justice? Because by involving them in social justice as a first step rather than the last step, we can engage them in reflection. Our young college students, this generation, they are pragmatic. They want to solve problems. So for an example, therefore they are very critical of interfaith tradition. Not too long ago, the Islamic community in Northern Virginia were attempting to construct a school. And there was a big outcry from the community. College students were observant. There was an indictment across the board. If this is what the people of faith are doing by expressing intolerance, and they will be very honest with you, we don't want to be a part of that intolerance. If Protestants and Catholics can have their schools, why not Muslims? And if the community cannot give an absolute explanation also why that was done, or help the college students to understand that, college students will write the faith community out. Typical example. Why is there such a paradox in the juvenile justice system when 98% in Washington, D.C., of all the young adults, teenagers arrested are African American? 98%. It is so high, even though it's not actually different from the rest of the U.S., but the D.C. data, for an example, is so high, it does not fit the Justice Department's formula for determining disproportionate minority contact. How do you explain that to college students with so many faith communities around? How do you explain to young college students that some of these kids have to go to jail in order to receive psychiatric evaluation or to have an assessment, medical and psychological assessment? How do you explain to college students the functionalities and the concern of the faith community when they are aware and are faced with such a data each time they go in? How do you explain that? How do you explain that in Washington, D.C. now, there are more families that are homeless than children in this history? Where is the faith community? This is a generation of college students who are pragmatic. They want to solve problems. If you want to appeal to them, you have to demonstrate that you're there to not only profess your faith, but actualize your faith in a way that they can be engaged. So the question for us in here, how do we reach the millennials? Is anyone here between the ages of 20 and 30? See, he's the exception. That's precisely the issue that we need to be faced with. I understand that different groups are working on developing brochures and texts on culture and history. That's wonderful. But the question for us here is, how do people of faith transform this nation here and now? Now, quickly, let me go back. Baptists, by the way, in the Christian community, Roman Catholics are the largest Christian community here in the United States. And to the credit, in Metro Washington, D.C., the Roman Catholic Church has the largest social services. They reach out to all spectrum of the community. That's an example of what other faith groups should be doing. At least, if not independently, preferably collaboratively. Solving problems. Making a difference. And you can quote me on this. Do you know how much it cost the DC government, at least 5 years ago when I look at those statistics, to keep a juvenile in jail for one day? $662 per day, almost $19,000 a month, and you multiply that by 12, at least $220,000 to keep a juvenile in jail. Enough to educate a child for 4 years at any Ivy League school. In other words, what can we do as a faith community? We can work miracles by encouraging and challenging our young people to say, you can make a difference, and this is how. And the best way to work with a college student is to mentor them. Because all of the great apostles and prophets, they related to people in a mentoring relationship. They made disciples and taught them. How much time do we people of faith spend with young adults who are in the formative years of their life, who are attempting to connect their education with their faith experiences? How many? And we are shocked to understand that the Pew report is saying that within the next 15 years, between 15 and 20% of our young adults between 19 and 29 will have no connection to any religious group whatsoever in the United States. That's what we're looking at. So what is our responsibility when we leave this place? Yes, religious freedom is wonderful. And in fact, Baptists, William Roger was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony because he was a Puritan. He dared to question the Puritan church on how they treated Native Americans. He dared to question that you can read the text and God can speak to you through the text, just as God can speak to the priests or the monks or the nuns. He was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, went to Providence. In fact, that's why he called it Providence, because it was a miracle that he survived the trip from Boston to Providence. And because of that experience, he stood up for the separation of church and state. He stood up for religious freedom and religious liberty. That each person is free to encounter God through the text. And again, like the Zoroastrians, under Darius the Great, those were actual facts of history, that he was one of the first persons to promote religious liberty and religious freedom, and therefore gave Jews an opportunity to leave, to go back to Jerusalem. And I also understand he also had some influence on some Greco-Roman religions in Rome. So, but what does that mean for us today? Who is going to stand up and to say, here is an opportunity? And I will be upfront with you. Most of us, I can speak for the Baptist tradition to some extent, are we actually ready and prepared to be open to sit across the table with a Buddhist monk, with an imam, and say, is there something I can learn from you? Because if I read the text of the Christian New Testament, again, Jesus engaged with the woman at the well who was a Samaritan. And when Jesus gave the example of who is my neighbor, he used the good Samaritan. It was an irony because nothing good came from Samaria. But in the gospel story, the priest came by and saw this man who was beaten up and robbed and about to die. The priest passed by. In fact, when they crossed the street, a second person came by, never gave a helping hand. It was a Samaritan, someone who did not fit the category of the religious establishment. It was he who came and got off his donkey and helped this man and put this man on the donkey, took him to the inn and paid for his treatment. Did not know the man. Total stranger. So when are we going to be to the place where we can actually offer help to total strangers and don't include it on our Facebook messages? Are we prepared to do that? So in other words, our faith expression, whatever it may be, is simply a first step. First step. We must be actionable. We must have a plan to make the difference. If you want to engage young people, you must include them. Expecting them to come to a temple, a congregation, simply for religious rites may not be too appealing. In fact, as a matter of fact, what they are getting there, they may have to be responding to several text messages. That is the reality we have on our hands. So let me end by saying, please, let this be a first step for the monks, the different traditions that are here. There are opportunities that we can collaborate to engage our young people in transforming this world. It is only by doing that that we can engage them in interfaith reflections. Are we willing to invest the time? Is the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaplain Johnson, for that wonderful talk. Last but not least is our Islamic speaker, Dr. El Gawari.
Thank you. Hopefully I won't take up too much time, but I wanted to thank you very much for inviting me and for putting this together. And I also wanted to thank your spiritual teacher for his words, because I think a lot of what I want to say are echoing what he said. I wanted to speak about Islamic teachings of suffering and attachment, and that's partly because of my fondness for Buddhism. And I believe that one can make a legitimate argument that one of the core teachings of the Islamic faith is freedom from attachment and human suffering. And oftentimes in my sermons, I talk about the Buddha, and I say, the only difference is they have an eightfold, path. Our path is a little bit different, but it's based on the same principles. And then when anyone asks me, what religion is most similar to Islam, I say Hinduism, hands down, and everyone gives me this peculiar, look, and as everyone has done now, and I say, well, if you look at the Vedantic tradition, philosophy of Vedanta in Hinduism, it is exactly almost verbatim the teachings of the Sunni theology and spirituality. So, and the reason I wanted to speak about this topic, rather than giving an overview of Islam, is that I think the purpose of these type of gatherings is not necessarily not just to educate one another about each other's traditions, but I think that we have to come out with some way of doing something together to make the world a better place. And I think that that's really what we're here, and this is your mission, and this should be all of our missions. And it's certainly something that we should strive to. When you look at consumption, I want to talk about suffering and attachment from the point of view of consumption. The statistics of American consumption are sickening. They're so gross, I didn't even want to bore everyone with all these statistics, but the amount of times people eat fast food per week as a main course, the amount of people that consume their meals in their vehicles, driving to work or driving to school or back, the amount of hours that our children are in front of the screens, the fact that we make up such a small percentage of the world's population but consume the gross majority of the world's resources, means that we, just by being in this country, we are consuming ourselves to death. And the Quran speaks about this, and God says in the Quran, mischief has appeared on land and on sea by what man has reaped by their hands. And of course, when the Quran speaks about man, it means man and woman, which is sort of like manu, the Sanskrit word manu, which encompasses both man and woman. So what the Quran argues, or what Islam argues, is sort of our fault that we've done this to ourselves. The Quran also speaks about man being created within a balance of nature. That part of man's creation, as an Abrahamic faith, we believe in the creation of man from Adam and Eve, etc., is that man was created in a world that is already set up in a balance. And our job is to maintain that balance, not to exploit that balance. So a lot of the problems that we have are really our own doing, is what I'm trying to say. And then the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he summed this up very nicely, and he says, there's a man who travels in the desert, and he's all disheveled because of his traveling, and he has no food and he has no water, and he raises his hand to the sky and he says, oh Lord, feed me. And the idea of the sequence of events is that we have a belief that when you travel, your supplication is answered, because traveling is a portion of, it's like a punishment almost when you travel, no matter how you travel, it's always very discomforting. And then the Prophet said, but his clothes are from that which is unlawful. His food is from that which is unlawful. His drink is from that which is unlawful. His whole nourishment is from that which is unlawful. So how is it that God will answer him? So the idea is that what we consume, we are what we consume. And that's why so many of our religions have different dietary rules. There are certain things that we eat, certain things that we don't eat, certain things that we eat at certain times and we don't eat at certain times. Because the idea is what we put in our system, what nourishes us, will affect our soul and the interaction that we have with the world around us. And to understand that is to also understand that, in my case, in my tradition, the case of the teachings of man and woman and the origin of the human, is that God gives this very interesting story in the Quran. In the 2nd chapter, he talks about the creation of Adam and Eve. And he says that I created Adam and Eve to be my representatives, my vicegerents on earth. But before I commissioned them, I taught Adam all the names of everything. It's a very beautiful verse. And what that means, it has a lot of layers of meaning, but the names of everything is God taught Adam how to use that which is in our environment around us. Plant life, animal life, water, all these type of things. And even in the Hebrew Bible, you talk about the name being the intimate knowledge of that thing. So when God teaches Adam the names of things, it means that God has given us the capacity to benefit from our environment, to benefit from our world, and not to exploit it. But God also created humans in our tradition with a body and a soul. And there are different opinions of what the relationship is the soul in the body, attached to the body, over the body, that kind of thing. But there is this relationship between the body and the soul. And as I said, what we consume affects this relationship. And our nature as humans is that we forget. And part of forgetting is we need something to help us remember. So that we believe, or our understanding, is that religion is a way of helping us remember these things that we oftentimes forget. And one of the things that we have in our tradition, that all traditions have, is we have fasting. And because we're on the very cusp of Ramadan, which is our month of fasting, I thought I would speak a little bit about fasting and its relationship to consumption and attachment and so on and so forth. The funny thing about fasting, we don't have to get into, every religion has different rules of fasting, but the thing that unites fasting is you stop consuming those things that we all agree are lawful. So we're not talking about I'm going to abstain from hurting people. We should always not hurt people. But in our case, we abstain from food and drink, from dawn to sunset for 29, 30 days, depending on the length of the lunar month. But those things are permissible. It's permissible to eat. It's permissible to drink. But we choose, or we are asked to choose, not to consume during these hours for a purpose. So even though fasting is difficult, what is the purpose of fasting? The Quran says, "O you who believe, we have prescribed fasting for you the way we have prescribed it for those before you," all of these other traditions, "so that you may attain consciousness of God." So the idea is that fasting, not consuming, awakens something, awakens the soul. It starves the body so that the soul can experience life, can experience a higher level of consciousness. Because our belief is when you keep consuming and eating and eating and eating and drinking and consuming, you become heedless, you forget. And again, we say we want to remember. So we remember by withholding from that which is perfectly lawful, that which is okay. We abstain from that so that our souls can thrive. So the idea of consumption and regulating consumption is that sometimes we have to just say no to consumption. And we have to understand the sources of what we consume, because what we consume is going to ultimately affect us. And even in some spiritual practices in Islam, some of the teachers will say, don't eat meat or poultry or things in which there's a soul in it, especially if you're going to enter into some sort of spiritual seclusion, because there's a concept that meats and chicken are quote-unquote heavy. So you eat them and they're heavy on the soul. And I know a lot of the dharmic faiths are like that all the time. Maybe Jainism is even the most pronounced of that type of dietary restriction. But there is wisdom in that, because people that don't eat meats and poultry, etc., they oftentimes they say that I feel quote-unquote light. I'm always alert, I'm light. And when you fast, in our tradition, that's what happens. Even though you get caffeine withdrawal the first couple of days, you can sort of get used to it after day 3 or 4. And then you feel almost fresh. You have like a spring in your step. Your mind is fresh. You feel very creative. Something inside you is awoken. And that's what I think our gathering is how do we awaken that within ourselves and within our faith communities so that we can understand that there is something greater around us for us to perceive this higher level of consciousness. And just to wrap it up, to come back to the topic of attachment and suffering, is that our consumption and our attachment to the things that we consume, these are the things in which suffering emerges from. And it's these things that bring us down. It is what caused the Buddha, for example, to renounce all of those attachments, because he didn't want to be held down, even though he had every worldly thing one can imagine. He had status, he had money, he had lineage, he had protection, he said, one person said he had a servant for his left shoe and a servant for his right shoe. But despite all of that, all of the stuff, all that bling, it didn't do anything for him, because there was something that was stirring inside him. So he left those things to teach us that attachment to those things, meaning in our language, in the Islamic language, reliance on those things, is what gets in the way of our understanding of the Lord. It's our attachment. And all of our spiritual practices like fasting and prayer and meditation, charitable work, social justice, all of these things are for us to go against our base self so that our self and our soul can lift in its status. So this is just a little bit about what Islam says about that. And I hope that this is the beginning of many gatherings, and I hope that we can take these messages back to our community, because as Chaplain Johnson said, and I'm a, you know, I have a young family, and I worry about my children a lot because I don't recognize the world that I grew up in anymore, and I'm not that old. And I worry about them. I worry about the world that they're living in. And I do what I do for my children. I think my generation is useless, and there's no good will come out of my generation. But I hope that their generation and the generation after that, maybe some good will come out of them. And I think that we have to be strong enough to speak out against this modern culture of consumption, not caring what we consume, where it comes from. I mean, now there's an emergence of traceable products, traceable foods. That's very, very important. And we should really be inject this into our faith communities, because what we consume will ultimately form us physically and spiritually. Thank you very much.
We should go to kind of train relationship with 20 minutes, and then we'll have a kind of.
Now all of our talks and presentations have completed, including our break. So now we go into the question and answer session straight away, and we'll have our break after that. So I now ask one and all, whoever wants to ask the questions, the mic will go to whoever raised their hand first. Yes.
Thank you. This panel is very enlightened and knowledgeable, and we are very lucky who could come here. My English is not very good, but I will try to speak in English. My mother tongue is Hindi, and I teach Hindi and I like Hindi. वो मेरी मातृभाषा भी है. Dr. Moon and Dr. Haver, you did a very good job to invite us, all of us here. So I thank you, all the Buddhist temple and all the panel members, you know. But my biggest irony is from my childhood, that I am a girl or I am a woman. I have attended many religious discourses from the childhood, that we all religions or the faith, we talk much more about dogmas and doctrines, and we all are very egoistic in the bottom. If we go in the seas, going the pulse, you know, and we all are proving that I am the best, and indirectly I have hate against you. And how I can prove I am the only good? And my head bows to all of you, and we all are talking on the big podiums, big talks that looks as graceful. Aha, so many clappings, so many people admired me. I could grasp this much big number of the people, you know. And this panel or this board, religious faith, you know, we can change the society. We should first kill our own ego, our own faith. I was very much shocked that when some panelists said, oh, India's flag, emblem, is not Hindu, it is Buddhist. My question to all Buddhists, with my all apology and humbleness, I seek your forgiveness. Who was Ashoka born? Judaism? Christian? Islam? He was Hindu. Who was Buddhist? Buddha was born. He was Christian? Islam? He was also Hindu. He was the son of Mahamaya and Shuddhodhan. And we are saying what we are proving on the emblem of India. No one admired that India is the only country in the world who never attacked to any other country. Or we are the only country. 13 countries are in Buddhist nationality, quote in quote, who give the asylum to Dalai Lama. Where were they? He was his own when he was getting challenged, you know. No one opened the door. And India opens the door and then India gets beaten out. Zoroastrians, many Muslim countries were there neighboring. Who give them asylum? This is our biggest irony. And my head bows to one person in this panel, Chaplain Johnson. Why? Because he is the only person who is thinking about the future generation and the young. We all talk, as he gave the number, that $600 per day. We are all putting our dogmas, doctrines, this and that. So we should teach in our schools how to raise children, family values, marriage, when you will grow, your finances. We say, oh, don't talk about the money. Money is crime. And tell me, with all religious, glorified people of this panel, where we don't need money. This big building is without money? No. You will be Buddhist, you will be Hindu, you will be Jain. Everyone needs money. And in the Bible we say, oh, a rich person can not go to heaven. So I'm very, very thankful. And Chaplain, I really like that we Indians can do something to save our future generation. Because any generation from history, time immortal, no one is always here. So we should learn good lessons. I am really thankful that you all should give me to speak and give me this opportunity. Many, many thanks from bottom of my heart.
Anyway, the kind is very nice questions, but now the biggest religion is not the kind of established religion. The biggest religion is the kind of religion of the Apple, religion of Samsung. Okay, so that there's a new religion. So I think the kind of next step we should kind of dialogue with the internet, not establish religion. So that's why the kind of I really kind of impressed about the kind of who the Chaplain Johnson. So that maybe the Chaplain Johnson, could you explain a little bit about how we do kind of who the make the dialogue with the young people who have the religion of internet.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moon. And I think one of the first things we can do is to begin with us here. For an example, we have a cross-section of faith represented here. And that will call for another sectional dialogue to follow up on this and say, what concrete things can we put in place? And then create an opportunity. For an example, we have college students who go to the juvenile jail and actually teach kids in there. On Sundays, and I extend an invitation to all of you, and Dr. Moon and Dr. Hobai and all of you here, welcome to do that. Kids who go into the shelters, they bring them to GW on Sundays. Every Sunday, we work with them. And on Sunday afternoons at the University of Maryland, kids who are on probation in the system, we need people from every temple here to be represented so that we can actually go out to say there is a better way. Because all of the traditions listed is ethics. And again, when we go to the jail, we don't teach Christianity. We don't teach theology. We teach ethics. And this is something that all of us here appreciate and will have to see from our different traditions. What is ethical? What is it they need to understand? For example, how do they deal with desire? Do they have anyone to show them the basic steps on deferred gratification? No. So we can begin by saying right here among ourselves, even if it's a conference call, there are young people in every temple and congregation here that can sign up for social action so that we can begin to have a conversation among ourselves As I said to you, those college students, young adults, when we leave the jails and we look at our text to say, what did the text say concerning the topic for the day? We have someone who's a Buddhist that can share that. And we are now doing it even with the Muslim community, even if there are young people from the Jain or Zoroastrian community, because believe it or not, most of our young people are unfamiliar with the text of our traditions. And I'm being honest with you. There are some who were baptized as babies. Their parents never took them to church anymore. And they came to college and they want to understand the faith of the tradition when in fact the whole philosophy of the college system is to deconstruct those historical realities. Yes. I've had students who came from conservative Baptist churches. And they're saying, oh, Chaplain Johnson? Man, I never heard that in my temple. I never heard that in my church. I never heard anything like historical criticism or form criticism. So what I have to do as a chaplain, I have to read the text. I have to write a summary of the text and begin to engage these students who came from faith background so they can understand the historical philosophies and also maintain their faith tradition and be faithful. That's my role as a chaplain. But so can that role be yours as a priest and as a lay person, because our young people are seeking guidance, and believe it or not, there are not many out there. And I'm simply telling you from my experience. As I said, the Roman Catholic Church has done a very good job by keeping full-time priests and campus ministers on these campuses when these college students can go too. Hillel has a lot of full-time staff that Jewish students can go to. But the fact of the matter is, for the rest of us, the internet and their friends are their pastors and priests. That is the reality. We have to do something about it. So thank you.
Do you have any questions here?
Yes, I'm curious about any ancient connections between Zoroastrianism and Hinduism. I noticed your reference to the sacred thread ceremony in Zoroastrianism, and Hinduism has this. You both use fire as a central focus in your faith. Your worship is symbolism. The time frame, even you mentioned about 1700 BCE for the beginning of the flourishing of Zoroastrianism, and this is when the culture in India with Hinduism and the Vedic tradition was flourishing. There are other things I could mention too. There just seems to be a lot of connections there, and I know there's a lot of debate about an Aryan connection, but the name Aryan and Iran, and I'm wondering if that might be the common connection between these two religions.
Absolutely. I mean, I just give a brief introduction about Zoroastrianism, and I did not connect with the period when the Iranians and Indians, they were together during the Vedic period. There was eventual split when one part went to India and one part went down to Iran. But prior to that, there is a great commonality between the Vedas and Zoroastrianism. You yourself mentioned the ceremony concerning, the fire ceremony concerning Agni, or the tribute to the wind called the Vayu, and so many other concepts. So much so that Zoroastrian scripture also is reproduced in Sanskrit. When the Zoroastrians went to India, some of their prayers incorporated the Sanskrit passages, which flowed into it very naturally. So yes, there is a great commonality. There's quite a bit written on it. We could talk about that, but there are great ancient traditions which are common between the two cultures.
I have one question, Dr. Here you go. Here you go.
Zoroastrians and Parsi, we call in India, they are a very, quote unquote, very affluent community, and they are, most religions perish with some war. among each other or from the outside force, you know. You guys don't have any war or any tool outside. You were the first in India, quote unquote, Parsis, Tata, many other industrialists I can name. And the Parsis migrated first from India. And your community is disappearing very fast in the number, you know. And you are not poor, you are family people, you marry within your own people, you know, to keep the religion and all dogmas and all doctrines very safe. Are you not scared that when you don't, like, if I am Hindu, and for a hypothetical moment I marry to a Zoroastrian, but I will not accept it as a Zoroastrian, and then I will leave the church, you know, or the Zoroastrian temple. Is it not very alarming? Thank you.
The news of our death is exaggerated. It's been spoken about for a long time, but yes, there is truth to what you're saying. Just like what the Imam said about consumerism, I think the Zoroastrians have succumbed to that, in that young families do not get married till they have settled down in life, found some accommodation, had a good job, and by that time it's too late to have children. That's one of the reasons. The other is this minority mentality that we've acquired over the years. That is true. That is happening, particularly in North America. The thinking is changing. The closed mind that we developed while in India, we developed a great welfare system for the community. You mentioned the Tatars, you mentioned other people, hospitals, schooling, everything was free. The community became, you know, expected that kind of charity from within. And that meant that they wanted to keep other people out. Oh, these people want to convert because they want to get all our welfare funds. So that is another reason for our decline, is that we've closed the walls around us. On the, to my mind, the false premise that Zarathustra preached a religion only to those who are born into it. It's a universal religion. You can't be stopped from thinking about any conceptual dogma or whatever it is for yourself. The same with Zoroastrianism. If now the Iranians are coming to us, those people who have now lived in the United States, they hearken back to their roots. And they say, what, we think like Zoroastrians, why can't we be Zoroastrians? I think our policy in that regard is slowly developing, and if anybody wants to think, they want to practice the concepts of good thoughts, good words, good deeds, you're welcome to it. We have no welfare funds to feel threatened here. So yes, there's a different approach developing between our thinking in India and now our thinking.
Yes, well, I just have a very brief comment. It's wonderful to see the views of different faiths, and there are more similarities, which I always believed, than differences. Now, the next question is to all of you and all of us, is how to bring our faiths good points for the goodness of the future generations, or for existing generations. How can we bring our best into the next coming generations, whether they are in jails or whether they are out? If they are misled, how to correct, how to bring them to a right path. That's the purpose of faith and religion, or whatever we learn from our parents and grandparents or religious leaders.
I'm a specialist in peace studies. Actually, according to peace, religion is troublemaker. Okay, so there's a troublemaker. So actually, the kind of, if we see the kind of wars and the violence, majority of the kind of words came from religion. Almost 90% of the words came religion. So that from peace study perspective. But today, all of religion talk of the peace and the cooperation, everything else. That's the ethics. It's propaganda. So the but means, in my understanding, from the peace studies perspective, religion should be minimized. That means if we have a conflict between the humans and religions, humans should be prioritized religions. It's necessary. So that's why we're meeting together, to have interface. That means interface is not to convert the people to believe in our religion. Interface means to understand other religion. That means if we understand other religion with kind of conversion, all of people be happy. So that's why throughout the kind of interface meetings, we ask the people not to be dogmatic, not to propagate their religions. If we make our religion as the best dogmatic religion, that's trouble. We should get away. Just we should make the people to be peaceful and ethical. If not, we will make a lot of kind of troubles, as our established religion did. So that's why I'm making the kind of this interface meeting, because interface meeting should understand cooperation with other religions. And then as the kind of Chaplain Johnson mentioned, we should be liberated from our religions. The fourth one, we should be liberated or detached from our religion. If not, we should dogmatize our religion and say our religion is superior to religion and make the people to be trouble. So this is why this is the first step. And meet together and ask you, the parish members, and then ask them not to be stuck in your religion. Okay? And then ask the people to be liberated our religion and understand the religion, make the peace. Okay? That's our. Another question, yeah, another.
So 2 comments.
I need to make a comment.
Comment?
I'd like to compliment the panel as a teacher of comparative religion myself. This has been a fantastic presentation of the truth from each religion without any compromise, and I sincerely appreciate all of you for doing that. The other part which I also liked is how do you make this practical? Essentially, that's the whole point, right? Whether your example to your own children within the house itself is the biggest example. That's what will carry that seed forward. However, one thing, and since I am part of this interfaith communities all across Northern Virginia, we need to take it out into the open society. It has got to be in the open malls and in the fields. So within the groups that we talk to, in effect, you're already speaking to or singing to the choir. We already know this. And the emancipation has already occurred in our heads and in our minds and in our hearts to a great extent. Even though there could be little stumbling blocks, that's where we are. So in my view, any interfaith thing of this nature should include an agenda which says how do we take actions and take them out into the open, where it is the common person who's out there on the street or shopping in the mall who's going to listen to these ideas. And that's my only thought. And once again, I thank you all for your scholarship and your presentation.
I really appreciate your kind of food questions. Okay? And also the kind of food bottle. Do you have any kind of food saying something? And then also
I think one of the things that we can do, and I'll give you an example. I went to the Parliament of the World's Religions. Talk about an eye-opener. It was in Salt Lake City a couple of months ago. I have 2 monk friends, Buddhists, and that I've worked with over the years in New York. And we met out there. One of the friars in my community, myself, and the 2 of them, we would go for one of the sessions every morning. And then we would meet and tell one another what we learned at the session, have lunch, and then we went on a trip together. There's nothing like friendship, I mean, and getting to know other people. I think that's critical, and I think the more friends we have, the more we understand that the barriers between us we created. God didn't create those things, and if you believe in God, you would. I think you would believe that you should be. Look, I'm from the Bronx. We're nosy, okay? We got to know everything that's going on, all right? And so we look over hedges, we look over fences, we look past borders to see what God is doing in other people's backyards. And I think that the more we can do that, that's number one. Number two, the more we can become friends and spend time with one another, the better off we'll all be.
I just wanted to echo what Dr. Tariq said and Chaplain Johnson. As a teacher in Sunday school, I had said earlier in my remarks that I'm a lay person, but I think young people are already ahead of us in terms of thinking about issues of social justice. They, rather than reflect on the religious roots, which some may do, a lot of them are already thinking about how they can make a difference. And I think that's already an area where, given our commonalities, we can look to address.
Okay, so Dr. Loy.
Thank you. I wanted to just amplify on a couple of things. I think it is very important that we realize that in some of these interfaith conversations, that we are not speaking, as it was earlier said, speaking to the choir or an echo box, an echo chamber. Because at the end of the day, you have to, the root of all of these issues when it comes to religious tensions is, what are the educational systems that are teaching young folks, not in universities, but much younger than that? And when you have views that teach young folks an us versus them mentality, that is the root at which you will have tensions between communities. And quite frankly, you look across some of the religious communities that interact in these interfaith dialogues, especially in the United States of America, they're actually vilified in their mainstream religious communities because that type of interfaith dialogue is not looked at from a mainstream perspective. So I think that it's very important for us to be realistic. And sometimes, quite frankly, I think it's very realistic in these discussions. Yes, we talk about our similarities, but if there are differences, that we be very truthful and honest about what these differences are, what the roots are, and how these differences are leading to actual people losing their lives today as we speak, right? So this is, I think, part of interfaith dialogue is to have a common level of trust so that we can actually identify what are differences, what are common areas of commonality, and that we can ultimately spread this message to a broader world perspective, which quite frankly, many times does not want to even hear about these interfaith dialogues. Thank you.
What it is also that one has to remember that, as Professor of Religion, I often said this to my students, at the ethical level, all religions talk alike. But at the metaphysical level, in terms of their creeds, forget about religions not talking alike. Even within religions, there are differences. So therefore, and then, just as there are similarities at the ethical level, which is how the ordinary man on the streets understands religion he understands it as a system of ethics first, to do good and so on. And then you have the system of creeds, the religion of philosophers and theologians. And then higher than that is the religion of the mystics, where all the religions unite again. Because the religion of the mystic is beyond words. He is into deep thinking and something that is beyond the ken of the mind or the words. So there's a kind of what, if I might say, a reverse kind of understanding of a hourglass, where religion meets on the top and at the bottom, but in between there is the difference of opinion, and that comes out of, I think, the historical context.
Yeah, now they kind of food. Yeah, Sandy. Yeah. Mike.
I wanted to react to something that Robbie said and some of the others said. There are some opportunities that are coming up. I think part part of it is building those relationships, as the father was talking about, to then help you to feel comfortable to have those open conversations, because it's hard to have those open conversations before you have a relationship. So what I would like to say is, coming up in September throughout the metropolitan area is the Days to Serve, and the intent is to bring together people of different religions, youth, middle age, and old, to work on common projects of social justice and other issues of concern. So I encourage all of you to partner up with another faith group in September for these Days to Serve. Thank you.
Okay.
So I had more of a comment and a suggestion. The comment is, you talked about faith of internet. It's called atheism.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So a lot of kids will not even volunteer or state openly what their faith is. They will call themselves, they'll say that I believe in universal God, and that's it.
Yeah, I think the kind of now if we talk about the internet religion, there's really huge topic.
Yes.
So there's the people kind of, when we talk about the church, they should have a church.
Yes.
And a priest.
Right.
But now we have a kind of the televangelist. So already kind of TV is the kind of church.
Right.
And and also the kind of in the school, if we talk to student, and then if they don't understand some things, they go to the internet, not go to text,
Right.
something like that. That's a huge topic. Okay, so that we should deserve that kind of topics for the next, maybe the kind of conference, something like that. So that will be cut down the kind of topics.
Yeah, and the suggestion was really that in many interfaith settings, including for the majority this one, it's always religion 101. And pretty much that is what I think the person meant about preaching to the choir. We all know 101. So maybe around what Chaplain said and what actually Tarek said, is if you can have a specific topic, and then you can highlight, and I must commend Tarek for really bringing out and specifically pointing out specific things to say, and you see actually that in Boy Scouts, and in Boy Scout in one of my friends, one of my son's church, he had people from across all religions helping out with his project. So going by the projects, it doesn't have to be a religion-based thing. Even though this one was in a church, he openly invited anyone to come and help out. So if you can make these dialogues more oriented on a topic, it may serve us better going
I
forward.
think the kind of, I really appreciate your comment, and also that according to the American religious history, interfaith began from the 1960s or the early kind of 1970s. And then in the 1968, so that they have a Supreme Court, and then according to Supreme Court ruling, the public school is not allowed to teach Christianity exclusively. That's the beginning of the Department of Religious Studies in the United States. So it means I am very much optimistic to the American kind of phenomena, because only kind of a world, the introduction to the world religions began from the 1970s. But now in America, interfaith and then understanding of the religions, so they became kind of another phenomena. That means now, for a while, maybe even the Christians are not necessary to understand the Buddhism and the other religions. And then the Buddhists in America also are supposed to understand the other religions. So that's why I really appreciate to live in the United States, because America is the best country to understand other religions than other countries. If I lived in Korea, we do not have the kind of wonderful panelists, just kind of Christianity, and then Buddhism and Christianity. Now we have a wonderful kind of panelists from different kind of religious traditions, even the Coptic, and then Hindu, and then Jain. It's not possible to have a kind of Jain panelist in Korea and a Coptic Orthodox Christianity panelist. So that means America can make a model of the interfaith movement. This is my understanding. Unlike the kind of other countries. So that's why we make the kind of the meeting, and then there will be the model for all of the people to cooperate with other religions. And then there's kind of beginning of the peace. That's my the kind of objective to make the kind of interface the panel discussion. Okay? Then.
My name is Henry. I was very impressed, touched by all distinguished and wonderful speaker. But especially I would like to speak in my religion. I'm just an ordinary Buddhist member. I can say Buddhist, my understanding was 6 characteristics. 6 characteristics. First, can say equality, number 1. Number 2, compassion and love. Number 3, the non-violence to living thing. Number 4, cause and effect. Number 5, the discipline. Number 6, enlightenment. This 6 is my understanding Buddhism. But when I listen to all this religion, they have a same common theme, like especially Hinduism, or, Catholic, all same. So there is not much difference. To me, it's like a different fashion method. So we are same boat, same road. So we working together, then we can have peace. Thank you.
We would like to now conclude the session because we're already over time. But before we conclude, we have a small honorarium for all of our panelists over here, courtesy of the Venerable Moon's Temple. So I request Venerable Tongvan to come forward and distribute to all the other panelists. So. To Father Gardner. Dr. Shivram for Hinduism. To Chaplain Johnson. To Mr. Shroff from the Zoroastrian tradition. And to Mr. Vipani from the Jain tradition. He was about to go, so to Mr. Dr. Roy from the Coptic tradition. Conclude. Thank you for all for coming. I don't have a gavel. I was never a judge, but I'm going to use my fist. It's concluded. Thank you.